think your wedding was awkward. In the Middle Ages, brides were 12, love was illegal, and the priest was optional. Welcome to the nightmare they called marriage. So you think modern dating is rough? Tired of ghosting, awkward, first dates, or swiping past 100 shirtless men holding fish? Imagine instead being 12 illiterate and getting matched by your dad with a man you've never met because he owns 3 pigs and a leaky barn. That's not a horror story, it's your wedding day in the Middle Ages. Love optional, dowries required, emotional fulfillment. Please, this isn't a Disney movie, it's feudalism. Welcome to the most unromantic era in the history of tying the knot. Medieval marriage was never about feelings. In fact, if you had feelings, you were suspicious. Nobles married to consolidate power, peasants married to share goats. If Cupid ever visited a medieval village, he probably got pelted with turnips and chased off by someone's angry father. And yes, speaking of fathers, he was the real wedding planner. Your groom could be 40 twice widowed and smell like boiled onions, but if your dad liked his land, congratulations, you're the bride now. Forget white dresses and wedding bells. The bride wore whatever wasn't covered in dung, and the only bells were from a distant plague cart. There were no florists, no slow-motion walks down the aisle, and certainly no trained harpists. If you were lucky, a drunk cousin might play a broken lute. If you were unlucky, the local pig would wander through the ceremony and relieve itself mid-vow. Either way, you weren't the centre of attention. The land deal was. Consent was a flexible concept. Canon law technically required mutual agreement, but mutual often meant your father speaks for you while you try not to cry. In some villages, a marriage could be declared valid if the couple said "I do" in the presence of 2 witnesses, priests not included. That's right, no church, no priest, no problem. Just a couple of onlookers and some very questionable legal assumptions. It was like speed dating, except legally binding and entirely irreversible. And once you were married, buckle up. The marriage bed wasn't a honeymoon suite. It was a shared straw mattress crawling with bugs, possibly located in the same room where your in-laws snored, farted and watched. Privacy was a myth, and intimacy was less about romance and more about producing as many children as possible before one of you died of a tooth infection. Bonus points if you survived childbirth without a priest hovering nearby with last rites. Even the celebration was more survival than joy. A medieval wedding feast might include warm beer, stale bread, and the questionable meat your uncle swore was definitely rabbit. Guests got drunk, fights broke out. Someone always threw up under the table, and if no one lost a tooth by the end of the night, it was considered tame. Brides often fainted not from joy but from hunger corsets, or the sheer psychological trauma of being 13 and already legally married. In fact, the only thing more terrifying than getting married was not getting married. Spinsters, aka women with boundaries, were treated like social outcasts. A woman alone was suspicious. A woman happy alone, clearly a witch. Better to marry even if your groom had lice debts or unresolved mummy issues. At least then you had some kind of identity, wife property, occasional baby machine. Beets being burned at the stake for liking books. Meanwhile, for the noble class, things were worse. Royal marriages were like hostage negotiations with crowns. A French princess might be sent to England at age 6 to marry a future king who was still learning how to walk and chew bread. Their union was less about companionship and more about not going to war. Sometimes the kids never met until years later, at which point one had syphilis and the other preferred monks. And yet somehow this system kept going for centuries. Why? Because it worked for everyone except the people getting married. The church got souls, the parents got property, and society got lots of confused, emotionally stunted children. Love was for poems, not for peasants. So next time your partner forgets your anniversary, just remember at least you didn't meet them because your dad sold a cow. Modern people say marry for love. Medieval people said marry before winter or die alone in a pigsty. The concept of romantic love as the foundation of marriage was about as useful as a wooden frying pan. Sure, minstrels sang songs about noble knights and ladies, but those were the medieval version of soap opera's escapism for people whose real lives involved parasites and ploughing. In reality, love was a luxury right up there with soap literacy and living past 40. Let's be clear, in medieval society, love was dangerous. Falling in love meant disrupting the well-oiled machinery of economic transactions, dowry contracts and political alliances. If a peasant daughter said, "But I love him," the village might collectively faint. Then her father would drag her by the ear to the man with the most land, most cows, or let's be honest, the least offensive foot smell. Passion was for sinners poets, or people with syphilis. Among nobles, the idea of love was even more ridiculous. Royal marriages were business deals in drag. A king might marry a cousin from another kingdom he'd never met just to keep the peace. And by peace, we mean tax income. If he actually liked her, that was an unfortunate accident. Most royal couples spent more time with their hunting dogs than each other. And let's not even talk about how many of these marriages were between people who shared great-grandparents. Love. Try not to vomit from the gene pool. So how did people get to know each other before marriage? Trick question, they didn't. Courtship was like ordering from a menu without pictures or prices. You got what you were given and you smiled through the rotten teeth. If you were lucky, you might have seen your future spouse once at a market stall or behind a veil at mass. If you were unlucky, he turned out to be a chronic gambler with 4 illegitimate children and a blessed pustule on his neck. And the women, let's just say romance wasn't exactly in the air, it was usually lice. Girls could be married off as young as 12, sometimes younger, with zero concern for emotional readiness. Puberty was considered nature's wedding bell. Forget personal dreams or compatibility, your dreams were to produce as many heirs as your fragile pelvis could handle. Medieval girls didn't fantasize about Prince Charming. They prayed their husband wouldn't be drunk, violent, or worse, boring. Men didn't fare much better. A young man might be forced to marry a widow twice his age to inherit land or pay off debts. Or he could be drafted into a monastery if there weren't enough dowries to go around. Falling in love with the wrong person was a crime against your family, your village, and sometimes the entire feudal order. There were fewer consequences for stealing a sheep than for marrying a peasant girl without permission. Now let's talk about the church. Oh yes, the medieval church, the original relationship therapist with zero tolerance for emotional growth. The clergy didn't trust love. They thought it was carnal, sinful, and a gateway to hell. Marriage was a sacred contract, not a feel-good festival. Priests preached that desire was dangerous and sex, even within marriage, should be for procreation, not pleasure. If you smiled during the wedding night, someone somewhere was probably lighting a candle for your soul. There were exceptions, of course. Scandalous stories of secret love affairs, poems passed in candlelight, and dramatic duels over mistresses. But these were the anomalies, not the rules. The average medieval love story ended with someone dead exiled, or locked in a tower eating stale bread and praying for divine annulment. If a couple did fall in love, it was considered a miracle, or witchcraft. Usually witchcraft. And let's not forget the most ironic twist: while love had no place in marriage, it flourished outside it. Troubadours, medieval influencers with lutes, sang endlessly about forbidden love, yearning and passionate glances. Of course they were usually singing about someone else's wife. Courtly love, as they called it, was based on never actually touching the person you adored. It was emotional suffering as entertainment. Basically medieval K-dramas. The idea that marriage should be built on love only started creeping into Europe in the late Middle Ages, and even then people weren't thrilled about it. Aristocrats scoffed, peasants were confused, and the church frowned aggressively. Love was unstable. Love made people do rash things like elope, write poetry, or question authority. Better to stick with good old-fashioned obligation. At least you knew where that got you: cold hands, shared fleas, and 20 years of strategic silence. Still, there were rare stories of affection growing after marriage. Yes, sometimes two people trapped in a thatched hut with no entertainment other than livestock eventually developed fondness. Maybe she laughed at his joke about sheep dung. Maybe he brought her an extra turnip. These were victories, these were marital milestones. But no one called it love. They called it not stabbing each other before harvest. If you're wondering about romantic gestures, let me crush that dream right now. There were no flowers. If your husband brought you flowers, they were probably weeds, and he was probably drunk. Jewellery. Maybe a rusted brooch handed down from his plague-dead aunt. Candle-lit dinners, only if you counted eating porridge in silence while rats chewed the floorboards. There was nothing sexy about medieval domestic life, unless you had a fetish for mould and starvation. Even language didn't help. The medieval vocabulary had more words for types of manure than for romantic feelings. No one said I love you in a soft whisper. At best it was, you please me, which sounds like something a bored king says to his favourite chicken. Poetry was reserved for nobles or monks having emotional breakdowns. And even then, most poems were about Jesus' death or constipation. So how did people survive without love? Well, many didn't. But for those who did, marriage was a duty, not a dream. You worked the land, raised your kids, and hoped that if your spouse was going to die early, it wouldn't be during planting season. Emotional fulfillment was for saint sinners, or people who could afford a second pair of shoes. In the end, love was neither expected nor required. If it happened, it was a cosmic accident, like finding a dry blanket in winter or bread that didn't taste like ash. But if you're feeling sad about the state of medieval romance, just remember, they didn't miss what they didn't have. And if they did, well, they probably wrote a terrible song about it and died before anyone heard it. Imagine you're 12. You can't spell your name, your teeth hurt, and you're still figuring out which mushrooms are deadly. Suddenly your father tells you to put on your cleanest potato sack, because you're getting married. To whom? A man with a battle-scarred face, twice your age, who smells like wet chainmail and has killed more people than you've seen turnips. Welcome to medieval matchmaking, where girls became wives before they became teenagers, and grooms looked like retired executioners with back problems. This wasn't a scandal, this was normal. In fact, if you were a noble girl and not married by 13 people whispered that something must be wrong with you, too skinny, too mouthy, or God forbid too opinionated. Men, on the other hand, were allowed to wait for maturity, which usually meant wait until they returned from a crusade with half a liver and a full-blown ego. The age gap, not a problem. In medieval society, the ideal bride was fertile and silent, like a sheep with better dowry prospects. Legally speaking, the church set the minimum age for marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys. That's right, 12. That's the age today when a kid might cry over losing a TikTok login. Back then it was the age for wedding vows and the terrifying mystery of marital duties. The church added a helpful note: the couple had to be physically mature enough to consummate the marriage. How did they check that? Let's not talk about it. Seriously, let's not. Of course the upper classes were the worst offenders. Noble families treated their daughters like diplomatic gift baskets. You could be engaged in the cradle, married before puberty, and pregnant before you understood how you got that way. Kings married off daughters for peace treaties, castles, or even just a slightly less hostile neighbour. The young girl's consent was irrelevant. Her uterus, however, was a strategic asset. Imagine a wedding where the bride has a doll tucked under her arm, and the groom carries a sword bigger than her entire body. And the crowd cheers, throws stale bread, and gets hammered on sour mead. The priest mumbles a Latin blessing. The girl looks confused, and the knight grins like he just won a horse. Nobody blinks. This was the medieval idea of starting a family. Not with tenderness, but with transactions and terrifying age gaps. But don't worry, sometimes the couple wouldn't actually live together until the girl hit puberty. Out of decency. So the 12-year-old bride might be sent to her husband's castle to learn how to be a wife, which usually meant learning how to serve food, spin wool, avoid eye contact, and pray. lots of praying. Meanwhile, the knight might go off to war or hunting trips or his mistress's cottage down the road. Romance was not part of the curriculum. Peasant marriages had a slightly different flavour, mostly because peasants didn't own castles. But the age issue remained. A father with too many daughters and not enough land might rush to marry off the youngest as soon as she could walk a straight line. Grooms weren't always knights, sometimes they were grumpy farmers with 10 fingers and 3 teeth. Still, the principle was the same: secure a womb, continue the bloodline, and get those babies rolling before winter hits. Let's talk about the ceremony. Picture this: a thatched church, 2 reluctant teenagers, or a teen and a weathered adult and a priest trying to stay awake through yet another legally questionable union. No vows about love or partnership, just contracts, dowries, and maybe a blessing if the priest wasn't already drunk. Sometimes they didn't even bother with the church. If you exchange consent in front of 2 witnesses, bam, you're married. You could do it in a field, or behind a tavern, or on top of a dead pig for all the law cared. And the wedding night? Oh boy, if the bride didn't cry, someone probably suspected witchcraft. The concept of consent as we understand it today didn't exist. Many brides had no idea what was happening, and no one explained it to them, except maybe a half-senile aunt with a potato metaphor. If the husband was kind, he waited. If not, well, let's just say medieval marriage could be the beginning of a lifetime of silent endurance and psychological scarring. Let's not romanticize this. Yes, there were a few cases of genuine affection, but mostly medieval marriage for young girls was a socially sanctioned trauma ritual. Their value was judged by their ability to bleed during wedding night inspections and breed afterward. If you were infertile, you were cursed. If you had only daughters, you were a disappointment. And if you ran away, witch. Burn her. Fast. To make matters worse, these unions were often orchestrated by people who hadn't spoken to their own spouses since Pentecost. Medieval parents weren't asking, what makes my child happy? They were asking, how many goats can I get for her? And sure, sometimes the child bride grew up, got strong, and managed to make the best of it. But don't kid yourself, it was like surviving a fire, then learning to bake bread in the ashes. And what about the grooms? Some were equally horrified. Imagine being a 30-year-old knight who just came back from stabbing Saracens in the desert, now being told to go easy on your bride because she still believes in fairies. Some tried, some didn't. Some were too busy drinking, hunting, or crusading again to notice their wives had names. If a groom had more affection for his horse than his wife, no one found it odd. The horse had better conversational skills. There were attempts to reform these practices, of course. The church occasionally frowned and issued statements like, "Don't marry literal infants," but the enforcement was about as strong as a damp tapestry. Powerful families ignored the rules and poor families didn't know they existed. By the time you brought it up, the marriage had already been consummated and blessed, and the bride was busy learning how to make stew with no ingredients. So how do we look back on this now? We can laugh darkly, because if we don't laugh, we cry. The modern wedding industry complains about overpriced cakes and bridezillas, but at least the bride isn't 12 and crying in a barn while someone forces her into a too big dress. At least we've evolved past the idea that a child can be given away like surplus cabbage. At least we pretend to care about love now. So the next time you watch a historical drama where the young bride falls in love with her noble husband, after one meaningful glance, remember the reality was a lot more bloody, buggy and horrifying, and probably smelled like goat piss. Let's get one thing straight, your daughter wasn't just your child, she was a financial strategy. In the Middle Ages, giving birth to a girl was like finding a goat you'd eventually have to pay someone to take away. That payment was called a dowry. And no, it wasn't a thoughtful gift or a polite thank you note. It was cold, hard economics wrapped in medieval patriarchy, and it made weddings less about love and more about livestock debt, and how many sacks of grain your dignity was worth. A dowry wasn't optional, it was the entrance fee for getting your daughter married. No dowry, no wedding. It didn't matter if your daughter had the face of an angel, or the singing voice of a nightingale without property cash or a decent pair of hens. She was about as marketable as a leper in a perfume shop. She could end up unmarried, ridiculed, or worse, useful to the family, which meant a lifetime of unpaid labour and helping raise your brother's children. Let's be generous and say you were a decent parent. You didn't want to sell your daughter like a second-hand plough, but society forced your hand. So you scraped together what you could. Some silver coins, a goat with a limp 2 bolts of linen, and your late uncle's comb only slightly haunted. You handed it over, smiled politely and tried not to cry as your child was carted off to a house that smelled like mould and resentment. If you were a noble, things were even messier. Dowries could include entire estates, titles, towns. Marrying off your daughter was like negotiating an arms treaty. If she brought enough land, you might avoid war. If not well, your enemies got creative with tortures. Royal dowries sometimes included servants' heirlooms and future promises like access to spring water, or we won't attack your western border for 3 winters. Love. No one even remembered that was a thing. Here's the wild part: dowries weren't just gifts. They were insurance policies. If the husband died, the widow could theoretically get the dowry back or use it to survive. But there was a catch, of course there was. The dowry had to be managed by the husband, meaning he could gamble it away, drink it, or invest it in a wagon business that mysteriously caught fire. By the time the wife needed it, her safety net was often somewhere at the bottom of a lake. Also, dowries weren't always paid in full. Some were promised and then endlessly delayed, leading to blood feuds, broken marriages, and passive-aggressive letters written on parchment with squid ink. In some cases, a woman would be married for years while her dowry was still pending, like a cursed Amazon delivery. If the groom's family felt cheated, they might take it out on the bride. Because nothing says marital bliss like, "Where are my cows, Margaret?" But wait, it gets worse. If the bride died early, which given medieval childbirth was statistically likely, the husband could keep the dowry. That's right, she died, and he walked away with the goat, the land, and the ceremonial cheese wheel. In some dark corners of Europe, this led to suspicious patterns where young wives accidentally fell down, wells tripped near fire pits, or mysteriously ran into a sword. Tragic and oddly profitable. Some fathers tried to use the dowry as leverage. You get the daughter, but only if you treat her well. In theory, this worked. In practice, it was about as enforceable as a squirrel tax. Once the deal was sealed and the feast eaten, the bride was property. If the husband beat her, neglected her, or locked her in the attic with a jar of pickled eels, no one came to check. The dowry had already been exchanged. Transaction complete. Now, if you're imagining that only women were affected, don't worry, everyone got traumatized. Grooms were expected to match the dowry with something called a bride price or mourning gift. Sounds sweet, right? It wasn't. It was basically a receipt saying, "Here's what your uterus is worth." Often the bride price was fake or symbolic, like a promise of protection or a future cow. If the groom failed to deliver too bad, the bride still had to deliver children. Let's not forget the awkward negotiations leading up to the wedding. Families would gather sometimes with legal scribes and haggle over the bride like she was a particularly fussy goat. She's beautiful, yes, but she has that twitch. True, but she knows how to salt meat and doesn't ask questions. These conversations could drag on for days, ending in shouting matches, broken goblets, and passive-aggressive toasts at the wedding feast. In some cases, the bride herself brought the dowry in the form of inherited land or valuables from her mother. This led to an exciting twist, marrying women for their dowries rather than in spite of them. Wealthy widows were especially targeted. A rich widow could expect more marriage proposals than a nobleman's daughter. Not because of her charm or wisdom, but because she came with a vineyard and a working oven. Peasant girls were often married off younger and cheaper. Their dowries were simpler, maybe a blanket, a chicken, or a family promise not to steal from the groom's grain supply. Sometimes the bride's family had nothing, so she married without dowry, a status that came with lifelong reminders from her in-laws. No wonder the stew is watery, you came with no goat and even less talent. family dinners were fun. And if you were a poor man with daughters, good luck. Each girl was a ticking financial bomb. Marrying them off drained resources. Keeping them unmarried. Social suicide. People whispered, "Why is she still here? Why isn't she married? Is she cursed? Is she—" Reading daughters were expensive burdens. Sons, on the other hand, could inherit land and bring in wives with their dowries. If medieval parenting had a slogan, it would be invest in boys, minimize girls. The dowry system didn't fade overnight. It mutated. By the Renaissance, dowries were institutionalized into ledgers and legal documents. Marriages were arranged like trade deals, complete with notaries and witnesses and multi-clause agreements. Love was still nowhere in sight, but at least now it had a paper trail. Women continued to be bartered, sold, and gifted, all under the shiny label of holy matrimony. Modern people complain about wedding costs. The dress, the cake, the DJ who only plays Bruno Mars. But in the Middle Ages, your wedding cost you something permanent. Your daughter, your estate, sometimes your dignity. It was capitalism with a crucifix. And no one smiled in the wedding portraits, not just because they couldn't afford teeth, but because they knew exactly what they were giving up. So next time someone says marriage is sacred, ask them if that includes the part where your dad sells you to a man named Ulrich in exchange for 3 goats and the hope you won't die in childbirth. And if they still believe in dowries, offer them a family heirloom, a sharp stick, and a reminder that progress isn't perfect, but at least it stopped pricing girls like mules. In today's world, consent is a sacred principle. In the Middle Ages, it was more of a punchline, except no one was laughing, least of all the bride. The idea that a woman should want to marry her husband was as absurd as asking a chicken if it wanted to become soup. If the father said yes, then it was yes. If the daughter screamed, cried, or tried to run away, that was just considered bad manners. Let's not pretend they were subtle about it. Fathers had total control over their daughters' fates. In many cases, he didn't even ask her opinion. He just signed the deal and handed her over like she was a bundle of firewood. And if she did dare to object, she was called ungrateful, disobedient, or worse, possessed by demons. Because clearly not wanting to marry a 42-year-old man with gout and blood-stained fingernails was a sign of the devil. The church technically required consent from both parties to validate a marriage. But consent in practice meant nod quietly and don't embarrass anyone. It didn't have to be enthusiastic. It didn't even have to be spoken in full sentences. A shaky yes or a panicked silence was close enough. In some cases, consent could be implied. You didn't scream loud enough, so that counted as agreement. Congratulations, you're married now. Fathers loved this system. It gave them power, prestige, and control over family alliances. Daughters, meanwhile, were stuck in a terrifying version of medieval Tinder, where they couldn't swipe left, and the match came with fleas. Mothers sometimes objected, but they had little authority. Their job was to convince the daughter to accept her fate with grace, like a lamb walking calmly into the butcher's tent. Some girls tried to resist. They cried, pleaded, threatened to join a convent, or actually did run away. But good luck staying hidden in a village where everyone knows your business, and the local monk is your uncle. Rebellious daughters were dragged home by their hair, and sometimes beaten until they remembered their duty. Some were locked in rooms until the wedding day, fed cold porridge and scolded by grandmothers who thought feelings were a plague symptom. Meanwhile, sons had it better surprise. A boy could negotiate delay or even refuse a marriage if he found the bride too ugly, too poor, or too interested in books. But a girl's refusal was a family disgrace. She said no wasn't charming. It was scandalous. Fathers would rather risk social ruin than admit their daughter had opinions. Some even threatened to disown or exile their daughters just to force a yes. Medieval parenting where emotional blackmail met religious guilt. Of course, the law didn't help. In theory, marriages made without consent could be annulled. In practice, no one believed the woman. If a case reached court, the father would say she agreed, the groom would nod, and the daughter's tear-streaked denial would be dismissed as hysteria. The judge, often a church official with 12 sons and zero empathy, would rule in favour of the dowry. Case closed. It gets worse. In some traditions, the marriage could be deemed valid even if the girl said no, as long as it was later consummated. In other words, if the groom proved the marriage with sex, her earlier refusal didn't matter. This wasn't justice, it was institutional gaslighting. The woman's voice didn't just go unheard, it was deliberately erased. Like she was part of the furniture, but with more bleeding. And speaking of consummation, that wasn't optional either. A marriage wasn't considered complete until the couple had sex, and by couple we mean the man took what he was owed. The woman. She was told to close her eyes, pray, and remember her place. If she resisted, he could force her, and no one would call it rape. They would call it marital rights. Because medieval law loved euphemisms almost as much as it hated women. Even outside of marriage, women's consent was irrelevant. Marital arrangements, betrothals, even engagements could be binding without input from the bride. If two families agreed, and the children were of age, which often meant barely out of diapers, then boom, wedding pending. A girl might find out she was betrothed when someone showed up with a wedding dress and a cow. Surprise, you're spoken for. Now go boil potatoes and try not to cry on the altar. In some regions, elopement was the only way for a woman to choose her partner. But even that was dangerous. Couples who eloped risked excommunication arrest or family feuds that ended in bloodshed. And if they did marry in secret, they had to convince the church it was legitimate. That meant finding witnesses proving consummation and enduring public shame. Because nothing says romantic like having to describe your wedding night to a bishop. And yet amid all this forced obedience, there were strange loopholes. In some places, two people could declare themselves married with just words, no priest, no witnesses, no paperwork. It was called clandestine marriage, and it terrified the authorities. Why? Because it gave people, especially women, choices. Naturally, the church scrambled to shut it down. Can't have peasants falling in love and bypassing the feudal marriage market. That would be chaos. In elite circles, consent was a formality wrapped in velvet. A noble girl might be asked, "Do you agree?" But the answer had already been written into a treaty. Royal daughters were pawns married off to secure peace or claim land. Some were shipped off to foreign kingdoms before they could spell their own names. And if they cried at the altar, it was chalked up to excitement. Or premenstrual demons. Either one. Let's not forget the priests. Medieval clergymen were supposed to ensure that marriages were consensual, but many of them couldn't read body language or didn't care. As long as the couple said the words, the marriage was blessed. No one asked if the bride was trembling, or if the groom had just bribed her father with a wagon of salted pork. The priest blessed the union, waved the incense, and went back to praying for less lice. Even when consent was given, it didn't mean what we think it means. It didn't mean understanding enthusiasm or free will. It meant pressure, fear, and survival. It meant weighing the risk of saying no against the certainty of being punished. It meant understanding that silence was safer than rebellion. Medieval women were trained to comply, and men were trained to expect compliance. The system worked. Horrifically. There were exceptions, rebellious girls who ran away, refused to marry, or joined convents to escape. Some became legends, others became corpses. The church didn't take kindly to disobedience, especially when it involved young women with opinions. Saints were made, yes, but only after their bodies were broken, their stories whitewashed, and their names wrapped in purity narratives. Resistance was not rewarded. It was martyred. So the next time someone says marriage is about love and choice, remember that for centuries it was about control. It was about silencing women, pleasing fathers, and transferring property with maximum shame and minimum paperwork. Consent wasn't a right, it was a formality. And if you were lucky, you got to fake it with a smile. Let's say you want to get married in the Middle Ages. You've got a bride, possibly terrified, a groom, possibly confused, and at least one sheep watching from the corner. But wait, where's the priest? The incense, the chanting in Latin that no one understands? Well, guess what? In many parts of medieval Europe, you didn't need a priest, or a church, or even a basic understanding of what marriage was. All you really needed was each other, a few witnesses, and a mutual agreement to say, yep, we're hitched. It sounds shockingly modern, doesn't it? Almost romantic. Two people stand beneath a tree, clasp hands, whisper, I do, and boom, married. But let's not get carried away with the warm fuzzies. This wasn't about love. It was about convenient social expectation and a deep medieval belief that God probably wasn't that picky. After all, he was already busy with plagues, wars, and preventing the moon from falling out of the sky. If you skipped the priest well, he'd figure it out. This was called hand fasting, and it was especially common in rural villages where priests were rare and overbooked. You might have to wait months for one to ride in on a limping donkey and bless your union. And if he died of dysentery along the way, well, you couldn't just not get married. Life was short. People didn't have time to sit around waiting for divine approval. If your neighbour saw you declare your vows and then saw you living together, congrats, society considered you legally bound. The church, of course, had thoughts about this, mostly along the lines of absolutely not, this is chaos. But even they couldn't keep up. For centuries, canon law recognised what they called verba de presenti, words of present consent. If a man and woman said they took each other as husband and wife, it counted. Boom. No ceremony, no paperwork, no one chanting Amen. Just two people, two mouths, and a terrifying number of social consequences. This system had flaws, huge ones. For one, it was impossible to prove. Couples could claim to be married without witnesses, or worse, one person could claim the marriage happened and the other could say, "What I thought, we were just chatting." Suddenly, the local court was dealing with awkward situations where a man was being sued for bigamy because he once kissed a girl in a field and called her darling. It was like medieval Facebook relationship drama, but with more torches. And then there was the issue of duress. If you threatened someone into saying, "I marry you, did it count?" The church said no, but good luck proving that. If a man dragged a woman into a barn, made her say the words, and then introduced her as his wife, some villagers might shrug and say, well, she did say it. Context wasn't a big priority when you lived in a mud hut and bathed once per equinox. To fix this mess, the church eventually pushed for reforms. By the 12th and 13th centuries, they wanted all marriages to be solemnized, meaning blessed by a priest announced in church, and hopefully not performed by two drunk teens behind a tavern. They even introduced bans where upcoming marriages had to be publicly announced for 3 consecutive Sundays. This gave the community time to object gossip or prepare extra cheese for the feast. But the people weren't always on board. Peasants in particular liked the old ways. Priests charged fees, churches were far. And what if you didn't like the priest or he didn't like you? Better to do it yourself with friend's ale and that one guy in the village who always acted like he knew Latin. And if problems arose later, you just sort of lived with them, or died with them, whichever came first. Nobles, of course, didn't have this problem. Their marriages were public spectacles, lavish ceremonies with tapestries, choirs, and bishops who were definitely not cheap. For them, skipping the priest would be like skipping the crown on coronation day. Besides, noble marriages were too politically important to leave to chance. Everyone needed to see the contract being sealed, blessed, and legally notarized by men in funny hats. But even among the upper classes, clandestine marriage was a problem. Sometimes young lovers married in secret to avoid arranged matches. Sometimes widows married their servants in barns, hoping no one would notice until it was too late. And sometimes noble daughters married rebellious poets with long hair and no land, every medieval father's worst nightmare. The result: scandals, lawsuits, occasionally poisonings, and very often more church reforms. One of the strangest quirks of this no-priest system was the idea that witnesses could legitimize anything. Couldn't find a priest to grab your neighbour and your goat. If they nodded while you said, "I take thee," then congratulations, legal union achieved. Some couples even exchanged vows over fences in fields or during walks. One legend tells of a couple getting married while milking cows, because nothing says eternal devotion like utter proximity. It also led to what we might call accidental marriages. Say a boy and girl joke around, repeat wedding vows for fun, and someone hears them. Fast forward to court, and suddenly they're being told they're legally wed and need to move in together immediately. Yes, that happened. No, it wasn't cute. It was legally binding comedy with a side of existential crisis. Medieval humour was dangerous. The church eventually cracked down. By the Council of Trent in the 16th century, clandestine marriages were officially banned in Catholic territories. Now, for a marriage to be valid, it had to be performed by a priest and witnessed by at least 2 people. The party was over. No more backyard I-do's. No more haystack honeymoons. From now on, you got married the official way or not at all. But even with these reforms, the idea that marriage was a private agreement stuck around. In remote villages and isolated regions, people still exchanged vows without priests well into the modern era. It was simpler, cheaper, and honestly, sometimes more meaningful. After all, the church might bless your union, but it didn't have to live with your mother-in-law. That was your problem. So what does this teach us? That marriage has never been a one-size-fits-all deal. That sometimes love finds a way, even if that way involves skipping church, bribing a neighbour and pretending a duck is your witness. And that when you hear someone today say, "Marriage is sacred," you should ask, sacred to whom? Because for most medieval folks, it wasn't sacred, it was survival. The truth is, no one cared how romantic your wedding was. They cared if you were fertile, if your dowry was intact, and if your union created more mouths to work the field. Whether a priest was there or not, that was just a bonus, or an expense, depending on your view of holy men in robes who couldn't remember your name but did remember to collect a fee. So the next time you stress about wedding planning, take a breath. At least you don't have to declare your vows next to a cow while your drunk cousin throws cabbage. At least your marriage won't be undone because someone forgot to tell the priest. And at least, God willing, you didn't say "I do" by accident during a drinking game and end up legally bound to your neighbour's sweaty son, all because a goat was standing nearby. Ah yes, the medieval wedding night. That magical evening when 2 near strangers, one possibly still clutching a childhood doll, and the other reeking of stale ale and chainmail, were expected to consummate their holy union. No pressure, just the future of your bloodline, your family honour, and the vague hope that nobody died during the process. The room wasn't lit with candles or scented with roses. It probably smelled like goat had straw on the floor and might have featured an audience. Yes, an audience. Because in many places the consummation wasn't just private, it was a community event. Let's start with the concept of proof. Medieval society had an obsession with virginity so intense it makes modern purity culture look like a casual weekend brunch. A bride's hymen was treated like a legal document, a family asset, and a battlefield all rolled into one. The wedding night wasn't just about intimacy, it was about evidence. Actual physical evidence. And what was that evidence? Blood on the sheets. Preferably enough to make a butcher nod in approval. Enter the ceremonial inspection. In many regions, especially among nobles and wealthy peasants, the newlyweds were escorted to their bedchamber by an enthusiastic crowd of family members, neighbours, and maybe even the local priest. They weren't just there to wish the couple good luck, they were there to witness, to ensure that the 2 people actually got under the covers and made it official. Because nothing says romance like disrobing while your drunk uncle cheers from the doorway. Afterward, the sheets were examined. Yes, the actual bed sheets. If blood was present, hooray! The bride was proven pure and the marriage was confirmed. Sometimes the bloody sheets were displayed publicly, like a medieval version of Instagram but grosser. In certain royal courts, the sheets were paraded through town like a national trophy. And if there was no blood, things got awkward. People whispered, mothers cried, priests panicked, and sometimes marriages were annulled faster than you could say bad lighting. Of course, the entire blood on the sheets concept was based on laughably flawed science. Not all women bleed during first-time intercourse, but did medieval folks know that, no, if the sheets came up dry, people assumed the bride was either a liar, a harlot, or secretly married to Satan. And who got blamed? Always the woman. Because obviously the man's performance was never the issue, even if he passed out drunk and snored through the whole thing. In some places, if the bride didn't bleed, she was subjected to physical examinations by midwives or matrons of honour. These were not gentle, supportive women. They were more like fertility interrogators with icy hands and zero chill. They poked, prodded, and passed judgment with the same delicacy as a blacksmith shoeing a horse. If they decided she felt loose, her reputation was ruined. If she cried, she was faking. If she protested, she was hiding something. Feminism hadn't been invented yet, but torture had. Now let's not forget the emotional dynamic of the wedding night. The bride was often terrified. She might be 12 or 13. She probably hadn't been told anything about sex unless you count a whispered warning from an older cousin, involving something about a log in the oven. The groom might be twice her age, eager, nervous, or simply indifferent. His only instruction, claim your bride. Her only hope. Don't scream too loudly. For noble women, the stakes were even higher. Royal marriages weren't just about sex, they were about politics, succession, and national identity. Producing an heir wasn't a request, it was a demand. Queens were expected to get pregnant almost immediately, and failure to do so raised suspicions. Was she barren, cursed? Did she not perform her wifely duties correctly? Meanwhile, kings were free to sleep with maids, mistresses, and anything that moved. Because nothing says divine right like double standards. And speaking of kings, let's talk about public consummation ceremonies. In some courts, especially in France and England, it was traditional for witnesses to escort the royal couple to bed, help them undress, yes, seriously, and then stay just long enough to make sure everything was in working order. After that, the couple was left to finish the job while the entire court waited outside, listening for any sounds of confirmation. Imagine the pressure. Now imagine it without deodorant. For peasants, things were slightly less theatrical, but no less awkward. You might have to share a home with your in-laws who definitely weren't leaving the room. Privacy was rare. A curtain if you were lucky. A blanket over your heads if you were creative. And if your new spouse smelled like fermented onions and had breath like a battlefield tough luck, this was your life now. And if you failed to perform, you might be publicly mocked, divorced, or accused of witchcraft. That's right, impotence trials were a thing. If a man failed to consummate his marriage, his wife could take him to court, and the court would test him. These tests included physical inspections, forced erections, and even performance demonstrations. Yes, in front of witnesses. Imagine a judge saying, "Please proceed, Sir Geoffrey," while a scribe takes notes. If the man failed, the marriage could be annulled. If he succeeded, well, he still had to live with the shame. Medieval masculinity was a fragile beast. Let's not forget the darker realities. Many brides were raped on their wedding night. There's no soft way to say it. The concept of marital rape didn't exist. If you were married, your body was your husband's property. He could use it as he pleased. Consent wasn't expected, and resistance was seen as defiance. Some girls were physically restrained, some bled for days, some died, and if they complained, they were told to be grateful they were honourably wed. The trauma was real. The silence was louder. There were attempts to romanticize it, of course. Troubadours sang of gentle grooms and bashful brides. Poets wrote about trembling hands and soft kisses. But these were fantasies written by men who probably hadn't bathed in weeks, and thought love meant not yelling immediately. In truth, the wedding night was less about tenderness and more about power control and patriarchal biology. And yet amid all this horror, some couples did grow to care for each other. They fumbled through their first night awkward and unsure and somehow survived it together. Over time, they found small joys, laughter during chores shared, bred the comfort of familiar company. But it wasn't the norm. It was the exception. A miracle growing in manure. Today we talk about the honeymoon phase. Back then there was no phase, just pressure to breed and hope not to die. Love was a risky side effect. Pregnancy was a given. And your future depended on how well you performed under a blanket, while relatives leaned against the doorframe. So the next time you light a candle, put on some soft music and whisper sweet nothings to your beloved. Remember, at least you don't have to prove it with blood and witnesses. At least your sheets won't be inspected like state documents. And at least your wedding night didn't end with your mother-in-law holding up your laundry and shouting, "She was pure." So you survived the wedding vows. You endured the blood-soaked nightmare that was the medieval wedding night. Congratulations. Now it's time for the feast, a glorious, greasy, drunken descent into chaos disguised as celebration. Forget cake tasting, seating charts, and politely clinking glasses. A medieval wedding feast was less like a dinner party, and more like a barn fire with a buffet. And if you think people showed up clean-rested or sober, you're adorable. Let's start with hygiene, or more accurately, the lack thereof. Most guests hadn't bathed in weeks. Some hadn't bathed that year. Soap existed, but was considered suspiciously luxurious, and hot water was more of a myth passed down by travelling monks. So when people gathered inside a packed hall for the big celebration they brought with them, the full bouquet of medieval scent, sweat manure, wet wool ale, and regret. And they hugged. A lot. Tables were long wooden planks covered with trenchers, flat stale pieces of bread used as plates. Forks. Don't be ridiculous. Fingers were the preferred utensil, and napkins were either non-existent or wiped onto sleeves dogs or unfortunate neighbours. If you were high status, you might get a piece of cloth to dab your chin with. If you were low status, you wiped your hands on your hair and called it a day. The food you ask, oh, it was plentiful. But delicious is a strong word. Meats were roasted, often beyond recognition. There were pies filled with unidentifiable things. Please don't ask what thick stews that smelled like boiled mystery, and vegetables that had been cooked into sadness. Bread was available in abundance, though it might be filled with sandbark or the occasional rat dropping. And if you were really lucky, a pie that didn't have a beak sticking out of it. But the real star of the feast was alcohol. Ale flowed like rivers, and wine was gulped as if sobriety were a sin. Drinking wasn't just encouraged, it was practically mandatory. The groom drank, the bride drank, the priest, if still present, drank. Even the local stable boy drank. By the time the third course arrived, which might have been swan squirrel or a pie with live birds, half the room was shouting, singing, or asleep in a puddle of gravy. Entertainment came in many forms. There were musicians, lute players, flutists, and maybe a man with a pig bladder drum. Dancers took to the floor, twirling and stomping often, to songs about lost virgins or heroic flatulence. If you were noble, you might hire a jester. If you were poor, your cousin with a limp told the same story about the time he saw a goat fall into a well. It wasn't exactly Broadway, but nobody cared as long as the ale kept coming. Things could get rowdy fast. Fights broke out over seating meat portions or someone making eyes at the bride. And these weren't casual bar shoves. These were full-on brawls with tankards, fists, and the occasional carving knife. Blood was spilled. Teeth were lost. A great feast wasn't truly great until someone passed out under the table and someone else proposed marriage to the wrong cousin. It was tradition. The bride and groom were expected to endure all of this with smiles. The bride, who'd just been publicly deflowered and possibly inspected now, had to sit through hours of noise, drunken toasts and dirty jokes from men 3 times her age. The groom, meanwhile, was expected to be jovial, generous, and slightly terrifying. People cheered him on like he had just conquered Constantinople, even if he'd spent the last hour burping into a goblet. And then came the toasts, oh the toasts. Long-winded meandering speeches filled with double entendres, religious guilt and farming metaphors. Someone would inevitably raise a cup and say something like, "May your womb be as fertile as the northern fields," and everyone would nod solemnly. Because yes, in the Middle Ages, even compliments involved agriculture, and sometimes pigs. Geese often brought gifts, though. That term should be used loosely. A side of salted fish, a wooden spoon, a goat that may or may not have stolen from neighbours. Wealthier guests might bring coins or fabric, while the poor brought whatever wasn't nailed down at home. Occasionally someone forgot to bring anything at all, and simply arrived with an enthusiastic smile and a mysterious cough. Nobody questioned it. Feasts could last hours, sometimes days, especially among the nobility, where demonstrating wealth meant feeding people until they collapsed. Entire deer were roasted. Whole pigs were glazed. There might even be a surprise animal baked into a pastry, because why not presentation mattered? A roasted peacock in full feather fashionable, a tower made of cheese show-stopping, a jelly shaped like a bishop's hat hilarious. Everything was edible and also slightly threatening. As the night wore on, people loosened their belts, their morals, and occasionally their pants. Peasant weddings ended with people collapsing in hay piles. Noble weddings ended with nobles collapsing on peasants. Everyone had wine-stained sleeves, grease on their foreheads, and stories they would only half remember. Children ran underfoot. Dogs stole food from tables. Someone vomited in the fire pit. And yet by medieval standards this was considered perfect. There was one final act, the bedding shout. If the bride and groom hadn't already disappeared into their shared horror upstairs, the guests would encourage them to do so with cheers, chants, and crude songs about procreation. Some families even sang songs with graphic instructions. Imagine your grandmother singing about thrusting rhythms while waving a sausage. It was a bonding moment, or a trauma. And then finally the crowd would stagger out, some into carts, some into ditches, some into entirely the wrong village. The newlyweds would be left with their memories a pile of bones and enough leftover food to attract every rat within a 10-mile radius. No wedding planner, no gift registry, just mud meat, and the faint smell of someone's uncle singing off-key into the void. So next time you attend a wedding and complain about the overcooked chicken or the boring DJ, remember at least no one waved your bedsheets in the street. At least your guests bathed in the same decade, and at least no one recited a toast about your genitals while holding a duck leg. So you made it through the vows, the blood ceremony, the drunken goat parade of a feast. And now, dear newlyweds, it's time to retire to the marriage bed. Except there's a problem. A few, actually. First, the bed might not be yours. Second, it might be crawling. And third, it might be located precisely 2 feet from your sleeping in-laws. Congratulations. You're officially wed, and the privacy you were promised. It died with the last clean blanket in the kingdom. Let's set the scene: a modest peasant home with 1 room. One, not 1 bedroom, just 1 room. Inside are 3 generations, a goat, some chickens, a hearth, a spinning wheel, and a faint smell of fermented onions. The bed you share with your new spouse is a straw-stuffed sack on a wooden frame, or the floor if you're lower on the peasant ladder. And yes, the goat sleeps inside. It's warmer that way. Also, the goat has seniority. Privacy as a concept didn't really exist. Curtains were a luxury, walls were thin, and people's definition of alone time was no one directly sitting on you. It was common for multiple people to sleep in the same bed, siblings, parents, even unrelated guests. Bed sharing was about warmth, not intimacy. So on your wedding night you might be tucked in between your spouse and your younger brother who still wets the bed. Nothing says passion like being elbowed by a snoring cousin mid-coitus. If you were wealthy, lucky you had a separate bedchamber. But that chamber was still draughty, riddled with lice, and attended by servants who absolutely did not leave. These servants stood nearby, adjusting pillows, pouring wine, or pretending not to notice as their employers tried to consummate their marriage while keeping their crowns from falling off. Dignity was not on the medieval checklist. Getting it done was. And those beds, oh, they were glorious disasters. Imagine 4 posts with moth-eaten curtains, a mattress filled with straw fleas or sometimes moss. The sheets hadn't been changed since the last family member died in them. There were no springs, no feathers, and certainly no memory foam unless you count the scent of generational trauma embedded in the fabric. If you were extremely lucky, there was a layer of herbs beneath the sheets to ward off pests. Spoiler, it didn't work. Now let's talk about the bugs. Fleas, lice and bed bugs were part of the package, an unwanted third party in every marriage. These critters lived in the straw mattresses, in the wooden bed frames, and in your spouse's hair. You could kill them by boiling your sheets, rare, picking them off gross, or ignoring them while crying silently. Some newlyweds got to know each other not through pillow talk, but through mutual delousing. Honestly, that was the romance. As for pillows, those were a gamble. Some were stuffed with hay, others with goose feathers, most with disappointment. And don't get excited about nightwear. Brides might wear a linen shift. Grooms wore whatever they didn't spill wine on. Some people slept naked, some in full undertunics, some in armour if they feared assassination. Because nothing gets the mood going like chainmail creaking next to your ear. And then there was the cold. Castles and cottages alike were frigid at night. Windows had no glass. Insulation was a dream. The fireplace rarely reached the bedrooms. So newlyweds huddled together not just for romance but for survival. The goal was to produce heirs before frostbite took a toe. Some nights the best part of the marriage bed was the dog curled at your feet and the vague hope your mother-in-law wouldn't cough blood on you in her sleep. But wait, it gets better. In many households, marital beds weren't private property. They were part of the inheritance. That's right, you might be sleeping on the very same mattress where your spouse's parents and grandparents consummated their marriages. Generational love quite literally soaked into the sheets. If you were particularly blessed, there was a notch carved into the headboard to record each successful union. Nothing sets the mood like knowing the bed has more history than the family Bible. And the sounds. The sounds. Wooden floors creaked, rats scratched behind the walls, old people coughed, children snored, and someone always passed gas. Trying to whisper sweet nothings in the dark was impossible when the guy on the next pallet was mumbling about grain prices in his sleep. The symphony of medieval bedtime was less Marvin Gaye and more farmyard tragedy in D minor. Let's not forget that sleep itself wasn't even continuous. People often followed a 2-sleep cycle, 1 block of sleep, a short break around midnight, then another sleep. That midnight window was sometimes used for prayer, sometimes sex, sometimes just staring into the void, wondering why your husband smells like pickled cabbage and hopelessness. No matter what, the marriage bed was less of a haven and more of a medieval endurance test with bugs. Noble families fared better, but only in size, not privacy. A royal couple's bed was often an object of public curiosity. Servants dressed it, cleaned it, inspected it. Kings and queens were expected to sleep together regularly, and if they didn't produce children, everyone knew. Sometimes courtiers gossiped about how often the royal bed was used as if it were a public oven or shared donkey. Rumours of infertility could topple dynasties faster than bad military strategy, and because marriage was a public contract, families felt entitled to monitor the couple's nighttime habits. Mothers-in-law asked questions. Priests offered unsolicited advice. A lack of pregnancy within the first year led to consultations with midwives, holy men, and occasionally exorcists. Because clearly if you weren't with child, the devil must be hiding in your womb. Privacy. That was a sin against the community's curiosity. Even when things went right, when the couple actually liked each other. When the room wasn't freezing, when the fleas had the night off, there was no escaping the weight of expectation. You were there to reproduce. That was your job. Romance wasn't part of the picture. If love developed later, it was an accident. And probably a dangerous one, given how often people were swapped, remarried, or politically discarded like expired cheese. Eventually, as houses evolved and people began embracing the radical idea that maybe married couples should have a room to themselves, things improved. Beds became softer, curtains became real, the goat was evicted. But in the thick of the medieval period, your marriage bed was a strange, crowded, itchy mess of obligation, noise and bodily fluids. And if you didn't die in it, you passed it on to your kids, with the bugs. So the next time you light candle fluff your pillows and pull the blackout curtains closed in your cosy modern bedroom, say a little prayer of gratitude. For the mattress, for the locks on the door, for the absence of your neighbour Gerald snoring 3 feet away. And most of all for the fact that your bed isn't a family heirloom filled with straw ghosts, and the memories of 3 generations of marital disappointment. Modern relationships come with exit signs: break up, get a divorce, block them on everything and pretend they vanished into the sea. But in the Middle Ages, no such luxury. Once you said I do, whether by priest pigsty or paternal decree, you were shackled tighter than a monastery gate in plague season. Cheating was common, divorce was not. And for women, well, cheating got you condemned, divorce got you burned. Let's start with fidelity, or more accurately, the expectation of fidelity. For women, it was absolute. A married woman caught in bed with someone other than her husband could expect shame, punishment, exile, or a swift introduction to the village stocks. In some places, she'd be paraded through town in a shift, whipped for every child she ever bore and branded literally with a hot iron. But if a man cheated, well, that was just boys being boys, wasn't it? Husbands had side chicks, courtesans, and chambermaids. Kings kept mistresses openly, sometimes funding them with royal tax money. Nobles had hunting lodges that rarely saw arrows, if you catch my drift. Even peasants got in on the act if they had the energy after ploughing fields and surviving dysentery. And when these affairs were exposed, the worst that happened was a disapproving look from the priest. Maybe, if the priest wasn't doing the same thing. The logic was simple. Women produced heirs and heirs had to be legitimate. If a wife cheated, how could anyone be sure the baby wasn't the blacksmith's? But if a husband cheated, who cares? As long as the wife stayed in her place and the children looked vaguely like the family goat, society kept calm and carried on. And the church. Oh, they had opinions. Mostly about women's eternal temptress nature and how Eve ruined everything. Now let's say your spouse cheated and you didn't want to suffer in silence. Could you get a divorce? That's adorable. The medieval answer was absolutely not, unless you're rich, powerful, or God himself. For most people, marriage was permanent. The church saw it as a sacred bond that only death or extreme paperwork could undo. It didn't matter if your husband beat you, abandoned you, or smelled like wet hay and rotting apples. You were bound. There was a loophole annulment. It wasn't technically a divorce, just the church pretending the marriage never existed in the first place. Grounds for annulment included impotence, and yes, they tested for that awkward consanguinity, being too closely related, which surprisingly happened a lot, or fraud. But even then, the process was long, expensive, and heavily biased toward men. A noblewoman might wait years for Rome to respond. A peasant woman. She didn't even know Rome had a mailbox. Some creative souls tried to escape marriage by running away. If they fled far enough, changed names, and faked their death, they might start a new life in another village. But if they were caught, it was Scandal City, especially if they remarried. Bigamy was illegal, punishable by fines, prison, or public shaming rituals involving turnips and chants. Because nothing says justice like getting pelted with vegetables by the same people who once toasted your wedding. Let's say a woman did manage to leave. What then poverty, isolation, danger? A separated woman had no legal status. She couldn't inherit own property or remarry without the church's blessing, which was about as easy to get as a dragon's egg. Many ended up in convents begging for forgiveness and stale bread. Some were forced to return to their abusers, and some, very few, survived clawing out a living as midwives, herb sellers, or professional widows read women who pretended their husbands were dead. Meanwhile, cheating husbands faced a different kind of justice. Occasionally they were confronted by the wife's relatives, brothers, uncles, or very angry grandmothers with soup ladles. If the affair involved another man's wife, the wronged husband might challenge him to a duel, or if he was poor and petty, just write rude poems about him on the church door. Honour had to be defended, but not the marriage, just the male ego. In the rare cases where women cheated successfully, they had to be cunning. Affairs happened in bathhouses, forests, or secret corners of the market. Messages were passed through servants. Rendezvous were disguised as religious pilgrimages. Some lovers communicated using coded symbols carved into bread loaves. Others just risked it and hoped their husband was too drunk to notice. Spoiler, he usually was. But if you were caught, game over. A woman could be sent to a convent for moral correction, or publicly humiliated, or in extreme cases executed. A man might be fined. Maybe, if his lover had powerful enemies. The double standard was so strong it could bend light. And the church, their advice to the suffering wife, pray, forgive, obey. The medieval version of just vibe and let God fix it. Royal infidelities were even more dramatic. Kings had mistresses with titles, palaces, and political influence. Queens were expected to endure. If they protested too loudly, they risked exile or a conveniently timed illness. In France, the king's favourite mistress had more say in court than half the bishops. In England, kings fathered so many illegitimate children they needed separate scribes just to keep track. Meanwhile, queens died in childbirth trying to produce legitimate sons, and sometimes cheating wasn't even about lust, it was about power. Affairs were strategic. Sleeping with someone could mean forming an alliance, getting land, or ruining a rival. A noble woman might seduce her husband's enemy to sabotage his estate. A merchant might keep a mistress who also happened to be a spy. Love was optional. Sex was currency. And fidelity, that was for peasants and poets. Of course there were actual love stories, tragic, doomed, and occasionally fatal. Two people fall for each other. One's married. They exchange secret letters, maybe carve their initials into a tree. Then someone talks. Scandal erupts. One flees, the other dies. The church condemns them both. And 200 years later, some guy writes a poem about it and names it The Ballad of Lady Idiot and Sir No Good Taste. Let's not forget the legal complications. Children born out of wedlock bastards had no inheritance rights. This led to decades of squabbles, contested wills, and the occasional stabbing at a family feast. Some fathers tried to legitimise their love children, especially if they liked them better than their official kids. Others dumped them in monasteries and pretended they were orphans. It was family values medieval style, but the worst part. Even if you didn't cheat, your spouse could accuse you anyway. Jealousy, boredom, or political gain could spark false claims. Wives were dragged before courts and forced to prove they were faithful through witness testimony, character references, or humiliating tests involving bed linens and questions about moles in unfortunate places. And if they failed, goodbye marriage, goodbye home, goodbye dignity. So the next time you hear someone say back then people stayed together, remember they had to. It wasn't romance, it was survival. Leaving was illegal, cheating was deadly for women, and marriage wasn't a love story. It was a cage with embroidered curtains, one that smiled for portraits while slowly draining the colour from your soul. So if your partner today forgets to do the dishes, just be glad they're not legally allowed to duel the mailman, accuse you of witchcraft, or lock you in a tower for flirting with the baker. And maybe, just maybe, whisper a thank you to the long-forgotten medieval woman who dared to dream of a life where love mattered more than land lineage and blood on the sheets. Let's not sugarcoat it in the Middle Ages. If you were a wife, you were about as legally respected as a well-behaved sheep. Slightly more valuable than a pitchfork, slightly less valuable than a plough horse. Marriage didn't make you a partner, it made you property. Official, blessed, parchment-signed property. And while your husband couldn't technically sell you at a village market most of the time, the way society treated you said otherwise. The only difference between you and a goat was that the goat didn't have to cook dinner. Once a woman married, her legal identity ceased to exist. She became one with her husband, not in the poetic soulmate sense, but in the you no longer own your body name land or thought sense. Under the doctrine of coverture, a woman had no independent legal standing. She couldn't sue, she couldn't sign contracts, she couldn't even testify in court without her husband's permission. Her new title might as well have been possession with hair. If a husband beat his wife, the law often looked the other way, assuming he didn't break too many bones or cause public disturbance. A little slap a justified correction. A few bruises, a private matter. After all, discipline was part of maintaining order, and wives like oxen needed firm handling. If the wife fought back, however, now that was rebellion. That was a crime. Because if a woman punched her husband, clearly the devil had rented space in her ribcage. Let's take a walk through the medieval market to compare. Livestock came with documentation, weight, age, fertility records. Wives, they came with dowries and vague references like strong back or knows how to milk. Cows were traded, but at least people haggled over them with care. Brides were bartered behind closed doors with a handshake, a nod, and a muttered joke about hips. At least the cow didn't have to act grateful. Speaking of gratitude, wives were expected to be constantly thankful. Thankful for being chosen. Thankful for not dying in childbirth. Thankful that their husband only cheated with the maid this time, and not with two maids. Thankful that he let her keep her wooden spoon collection. Gratitude was the only luxury a medieval wife could afford. Jewellery, number autonomy, ha! But you could definitely have a grateful attitude while hand-washing his chainmail. And let's not pretend nobility changed the rules. A queen might wear a crown, but she still needed her husband's permission to do pretty much anything beyond blinking. Noble women were moved around like game pieces, married off, traded, remarried if convenient, and often blamed for not producing male heirs. If she ruled in her husband's absence, it was only because there were no men available. As soon as one showed up, even a half-witted cousin with gout, she was politely shoved off the throne. Now let's talk economics. A married woman couldn't own property in her own name. If she inherited land, it went to her husband. If she earned money, he controlled it. If she built a thriving cheese business, he could take the profits and then accuse her of witchcraft if he got jealous. In some regions, if a woman didn't turn over her income, she could be legally punished for theft of her own labour. The law had a sense of humour, a very bad one, and yet livestock, dear innocent livestock, had clearer protections. Medieval law codes often included entire sections on animal welfare. There were fines for beating animals too harshly, for neglecting to feed them, even for overworking them. Meanwhile, wives could be worked to the bone-fed scraps and kept barefoot and pregnant with no legal consequences. If you were a cow, you had a shot at justice. If you were a woman, you had a shot at soup duty. And don't think religion helped. The church preached that women were made from Adam's rib, which was apparently shorthand for eternally secondary. The ideal wife was obedient, silent, modest, and very, very tired. If she complained, she was sinful. If she argued, she was unnatural. If she wanted to read or think, she was probably a witch. The Virgin Mary was the model pure passive and definitely not trying to open a small business. Speaking of business, if a married couple ran a shop together, everyone assumed the man did all the real work. The wife might organise the books, deal with customers and handle inventory, while her husband drank himself sideways in the back. Still, when people asked who runs this place, the answer was Master John, of course. If she insisted otherwise, she'd be laughed out of town, or accused of sorcery, which was the medieval version of a performance review. Let's say the husband died. Finally, a woman might get some legal space. As a widow, she could inherit property, run her own household, even remarry on her own terms. Some widows flourished. They became landowners, guild members, power brokers. Others were forced into convents, pressured to remarry immediately, or stripped of assets by their late husband's family. Because clearly a woman alone couldn't possibly function without someone nearby to explain basic arithmetic and open jars. There were exceptions, of course. Women who fought the system defied the odds, made names for themselves. But they were anomalies, outliers. And often their stories ended in flame prison or a sad poem written centuries later by someone who wished society had done better. Most women did what they had to do, kept their heads down, found joy where they could, and tried to survive long enough to see their daughters not suffer as much. Even women's bodies were considered communal property. Reproduction was mandatory. If you couldn't bear children, your value plummeted. If you bore too many children, you died. Either way, it was your job to make babies feed babies and bury babies with dignity while smiling and folding laundry. Husbands could demand sex. The law backed them. The church encouraged them. The culture celebrated them. And the wife, she prayed for early menopause and a peaceful death. So what rights did wives have? Let's see. She could spin. She could knead. She could walk behind her husband without raising her voice. She could be proud of her son if he lived past 5. She could attend church, confess sins that weren't her fault, and sing songs about saints who never had to clean chamber pots. She could wait. She could endure. She could love quietly if it didn't interfere with cooking dinner, but she could not be. Not fully. Not freely. Not without being someone's wife, someone's daughter, someone's shadow. Livestock had clearer boundaries. Horses didn't get blamed for crop failure. Pigs didn't get burned at the stake for having dreams. Chickens weren't scolded for wanting more space in the coop. But women were expected to be grateful just to be allowed to exist. So the next time someone romanticizes the traditional role of women, remind them that tradition once meant being owned, overworked, and legally invisible. And the next time your partner asks why you're taking up the whole bed, gently remind them that at least you have a bed and not a straw mat shared with 4 siblings, 2 chickens and a husband who believes your uterus belongs to the king. Getting married in the Middle Ages wasn't about companionship. It wasn't about romance. It was about producing children and fast. Not just any children, mind you. Preferably boys. Strong, healthy, land-inheriting boys with good lungs, sturdy limbs, and 0 personality because no one cared what kind of poetry they wrote. You were a wife now, which meant your womb had officially been leased by the state, the church, and your in-laws. Pregnancy was not a glow-up moment. There were no bump photos, no baby showers, no cute little onesies. You got a few pity nods at church and maybe a bucket to throw up in if you were lucky. Most women didn't even know they were pregnant until they missed their second period or passed out while churning butter. There were no tests, just hunches. Sometimes literally your back hurt, your feet swelled, and suddenly you were a national investment. Once your pregnancy became obvious, people treated you like both a holy vessel and a walking corpse. Neighbours offered useless advice like eat more boiled turnips, it strengthens the baby's spine. Priests reminded you that pain during childbirth was Eve's fault, and your mother-in-law hovered like a medieval hawk, judging your every movement, how you sat, how you walked, how often you looked too happy. Happiness meant temptation. Temptation meant stillbirth. Obviously. Let's talk about prenatal care or the lack thereof. No vitamins, no ultrasounds, no licensed doctors. You had midwives who were equal parts healer gossip hub and semi-trained herbalist. Some were good, others accidentally killed people with bad root combinations. Still, they knew more about childbirth than most official male physicians who usually showed up late muttered in Latin and prescribed bleeding for everything including labour. And nutrition? Laughable. If you were lucky, you ate porridge-boiled greens and stale bread. Meat was a luxury, fruit was suspicious. Cravings were seen as spiritual weakness. If you asked for fish and your husband brought home mouldy cheese instead, you smiled and said thank you, then cried in the hayloft. And if the baby kicked too much demonic possession, call the priest, burn the herbs, hope the baby comes out head first and not with horns. The risk of miscarriage was high. The risk of infection was higher. And if you survived the pregnancy, you still had to survive labour. Childbirth was not a peaceful event. It was a blood-soaked battle with no anaesthesia, no understanding of hygiene, and no epidural to scream for. Your birthing bed was a wooden bench, your midwife had hands like tree bark, and the only pain relief was prayer, or if you were lucky biting down on a piece of cloth that hadn't already been chewed by a rat. Labour could last hours or days. Sometimes you died before the baby ever came. Sometimes both of you died. Sometimes the baby lived and the mother didn't, and everyone still called it a success. If the baby was a boy, people celebrated. If it was a girl, someone coughed awkwardly and tried to sound hopeful. Maybe next time they'd say already thinking about what to name the next attempt. If you had too many girls in a row, people assumed you were cursed. Or worse, infertile. Let's not forget the pressure. Producing sons wasn't just expected, it was demanded. If you gave birth to daughters, your status dropped faster than a leaky roof in a thunderstorm. Your husband might start looking elsewhere. Your in-laws might blame your weak blood. The village midwife might whisper about evil omens. Nobody questioned the man's contribution. Sperm, what's that? Clearly the woman's womb had failed to correctly manifest a penis. That was her problem. And if the child was deformed sickly or didn't cry right away, panic. Superstition. Baptism in a panic, often with cold water and shouted Latin. Some believed malformed babies were changelings swapped by fairies or demons. These infants might be abandoned, hidden, or smothered for their own good. All while the mother wept silently and prayed her next child wouldn't come out wrong. Recovery from childbirth. Not a thing. You got maybe a few days to lie down if you didn't die. Then it was back to hauling water, grinding flour, and acting like your uterus hadn't just been through a medieval war. Postpartum depression. Not acknowledged. If you looked sad, people assumed you were possessed. If you tried to run away, they assumed you were mad. If you screamed or sobbed or refused to eat congratulations, you were now eligible for an exorcism. The church told you childbirth pain was punishment for original sin. Midwives told you to pray harder next time. Your husband told you to hurry up and heal so you could do it again. Because babies died often. You needed backups. 5 children born might mean 2 survived. 1 boy, if you were very lucky. If none made it, try again, and again, and again until your body collapsed, or someone else's daughter replaced you. Stillbirths were common. Grief wasn't public. You buried your child, named or unnamed, and moved on. No graveside speeches, no counselling, just more chores and a tight-lipped priest who muttered that perhaps you had sinned too recently. If you dared to mourn too long, you were told to toughen up, because children weren't really children until they were old enough to work. Losing a baby was considered less tragic than losing a pig during winter. And if you died in childbirth, well, people said nice things about your virtue. Maybe someone carved a poorly spelled cross for your grave. Maybe your husband cried. Maybe he remarried before your body was cold. Maybe your daughter grew up and repeated the whole thing, and the cycle continued, birth, bleed, repeat. Of course, some women survived. Some even lived through 5, 6, 10 births. They were called strong, or blessed, or witches, depending on how cheerful they looked afterward. Their reward? More work, more mouths to feed, more pregnancies, and the growing anxiety that if they ever failed to produce a son again, their place at the table would be replaced by a younger woman with stronger hips and less history. Let's not ignore the absurd birthing rituals. Women were sometimes forced to give birth while standing squatting or even kneeling on cold floors because comfort was for heretics. Superstitions ruled the process. Don't untie knots in the house, or the baby will get tangled. Don't let a dog near the bed. Don't say the baby's name aloud. Don't sneeze. Don't breathe wrong. And whatever you do, don't die. Because that was very inconvenient for everyone. Sometimes women gave birth alone, in a barn, in the woods, during war, during famine, during winter storms while clutching the hem of their own skirts. their screams muffled by snow or thunder or shame. There were no hashtags, no candlelight vigils, just blood on the ground and another name whispered to the wind. And no one remembered their names, just their wombs, their function, their failure or success. So the next time you hear someone pine for traditional motherhood, remind them what that actually meant, gambling your life every time your period was late, hoping for a boy, hoping for survival, hoping that this time maybe, just maybe, the blood wouldn't be yours. In modern times, weddings are supposed to be about love connection, and maybe a battle over the guest list. In the Middle Ages, weddings were war with cake, political warfare disguised as a family gathering. Forget roses and violin quartets. Medieval marriage was diplomacy wrapped in linen, sealed with a bloodline and served with a side of treason. If your daughter married the wrong man, you didn't just lose face. You lost land titles and possibly your entire kingdom. Nothing said congratulations like annexation. Among the nobility, weddings were not sweet celebrations, they were chess moves. Marriages created alliances, silenced rivals, bought armies and occasionally prevented wars or just as often started them. Kings didn't marry for love. They married for strategic waterways, mountain passes and dowries fat enough to fund a crusade. If a duke's only child married the prince of the neighbouring realm, that wasn't a romance. It was a military non-aggression pact with baked goods. Royal children were pawns long before puberty. A princess might be promised to a foreign lord before she could walk, with the hope that 15 years later she'd be able to produce an heir and not poison the dinner. Engagements were drawn up like battle treaties. Scrolls were signed, witnesses gathered, and oaths were sworn sometimes by men who would later break them with a smile and a sword. And if the bride objected, too bad. Her uterus had already been pledged to a cause. The negotiation process for these marriages was grueling. Ambassadors met for months to discuss dowry amounts, territorial exchanges, and who got to name the firstborn. There were arguments about whose family had more saints, whose banner flew higher, and whether the betrothed shared too many grandparents. They often did. And once everything was agreed upon, they sealed it with a ceremony and a feast, during which everyone pretended it wasn't just a land grab with nicer outfits. Sometimes political marriages went off the rails. A king might promise his daughter to a foreign prince only for the prince to die of plague, get assassinated, or run off with a nun. Suddenly the entire alliance crumbled. Wars erupted, lands were seized. Cousins who once toasted each other across banquet halls were now lobbing arrows over castle walls, all because little Lady Matilda married the wrong guy. Of course, some families tried to hedge their bets by marrying their kids within the family. Cousins marrying cousins was common because who needs fresh DNA when you can keep all the land in one gloriously inbred package? The church pretended to frown on this, but exemptions were handed out like bread at a funeral. As long as you donated enough gold, God apparently looked the other way while your children developed 3 eyebrows and a mysterious limp. And let's not forget the papacy's role in all this. Popes had immense power over which marriages were valid and which ones weren't. If a union threatened papal influence, they might suddenly discover the couple was too closely related, even if they lived on opposite ends of the continent. But if the match served Rome's agenda, the Pope would bless it faster than you could say indulgence. Politics, after all, was holier than thou. In some infamous cases, weddings were used to trap people. Invite your rival to your daughter's wedding toast of peace, and then arrest him before dessert. It happened. More than once. Because weddings were one of the few events where your enemies would show up willingly and possibly drunk. What better time to launch a coup than when everyone's full of goose and distracted by dancers with bells on their knees? Among lesser nobles, marriages served local ambitions. Marry the blacksmith's daughter, gain access to steel. Marry the miller's son, get cheaper flour. Marry the baron's widow, and suddenly you own 1/3 of the valley. These unions weren't about compatibility. They were about leverage. You didn't ask, do I love her? You asked, what does she bring to the table, and is it more than last year's harvest? Women, of course, had almost no say in any of this. They were bargaining chips passed between families like expensive horses with better hair. Their value lay in their virginity, their family name, and their ability to produce male heirs who didn't die of pneumonia before age 5. If a noblewoman did fall in love and try to marry for affection, the scandal was enormous. Entire regions might descend into chaos just because Lady Eleanor liked a lute player, and if a politically married couple hated each other, tough luck. Divorce wasn't an option. Affairs were dangerous. Murder was inconvenient. So you learned to tolerate your spouse the way a knight tolerated chainmail, uncomfortable, heavy, and prone to rust. Some couples lived apart, entirely ruling separate lands and exchanging letters once a year like awkward pen pals. Others coexisted in mutual loathing, attending feasts together with forced smiles and separate lovers. Royal women had it especially bad. Sent off to foreign courts as teenagers, they were expected to master the language, adopt new customs, and charm a new set of in-laws, all while quietly producing heirs and pretending not to miss their home. Some became queens, others became pawns in dynastic disputes, exiled or executed when politics turned sour. A single queen's womb could determine the fate of empires, and when it failed, the empire blamed her diet, her prayers, or her attitude. Weddings themselves were loaded with symbolism. The bride wore colours representing her family's house. The groom might display captured banners from previous battles. Gifts were exchanged, not just rings, but castles, gold, vineyards, or sometimes villages. Yes, entire villages. Here, darling, I got you 300 serfs for our anniversary. They can't read, but they farm potatoes like angels. And if the couple didn't produce an heir, cue the whispers, the blame, the slow erosion of alliances. A barren marriage was a failed treaty, and a failed treaty meant open conflict. Land changed hands, armies mobilized, peasants paid the price. All because two teenagers married off at 16 for the sake of trade routes couldn't make the political magic happen in the bedroom. And when political marriages succeeded, peace was temporary. Because once the old king died, or the heir was kidnapped, or someone remembered a decades-old insult, those bonds frayed. Loyalty was thin. Greed was thick. And the same cousin who toasted your wedding might be sharpening his sword under the table, just waiting for your father to choke on a goose bone. So the next time you see a royal wedding on television, complete with tiaras and polite smiles, remember, this tradition has blood on its hands. Not metaphorically, literally. These weren't love stories. They were treaties with corsets, land swaps with flower crowns. And beneath every toast to eternal union, there was always a dagger waiting in the shadows, just in case the marriage didn't quite go according to plan. Let's say you're a medieval girl. You've dodged the arranged marriage with the 40-year-old goat farmer. You've successfully avoided becoming political currency in a wedding treaty between two sweaty cousins. What now, easy? You take the one noble exit still available to a woman with ambition, intelligence, or just an allergy to childbirth. You become a nun. And yes, it was exactly as fun as it sounds, unless you enjoyed silent self-flagellation and never touching cheese without permission. For some, the convent was a refuge. For others, it was a polite prison. And for most, it was the best, worst option available. Becoming a nun meant no husband, no children, no estate to manage, and no one breathing onion ale in your face every night. But it also meant no say in what you did, where you lived, what you wore, or how much you got to sleep. Think of it as early enrolment in God's HR department, with fewer sick days and much more incense. The process began early. Girls as young as 7 were placed in convents to be raised in virtue. This was often a family's way of saying, "We ran out of dowry money, but she can still be holy." Others were sent because they had too much curiosity, too many opinions, or red hair, clearly a sign of temptation. In some cases, daughters were locked away in nunneries to atone for family sins. Yes, your father started a feud that burned down 3 villages. You get the vow of chastity. Taking the veil wasn't just a religious ceremony, it was a transfer of ownership. Your hair was cut because vanity was sinful and hair attracted thoughts. Your name might be changed because why not lose your identity twice? And you were given a habit made of wool that could double as a torture device. Your possessions were surrendered to the order. Your future now involved prayer porridge and possibly being awakened at 3 a.m. to chant psalms while half asleep and fully frozen. Nuns lived under strict rules, some so extreme they make military boot camps look like yoga retreats. Depending on the order, silence was enforced, eye contact discouraged, and personal thoughts considered spiritually suspicious. You rose before dawn, prayed, worked, prayed, again, ate something vaguely edible, then prayed until your knees gave out. You weren't allowed mirrors, music, or laughter that lasted longer than 3 seconds. Joy was regulated. Giggling was practically heresy. Still, some women flourished. Nuns could be literate, educated, even powerful. Convents were among the few places where women could read, write, and escape pregnancy. In some regions, abbesses ruled entire estates, managed finances, and made decisions that men had to respect through gritted teeth, of course. A clever woman could rise through the ranks, wield influence, and send snarky letters to bishops. Behind those stone walls, she could become more than a wife. She could become dangerous. But power came with risk. A nun who stepped out of line could be punished severely. Solitary confinement, reduced rations, or forced public confessions were common. If you questioned authority, interpreted scripture too boldly, or were caught with smuggled cheese under your robes, your reputation might be destroyed. And if you were really unlucky, they'd accuse you of being possessed, and your next roommate would be an exorcist with garlic breath. Not all nuns chose the life willingly. Some were widows with no other home. Others were donated by their families to secure salvation, and some were outright dump their unwanted daughters, scandal-prone nieces or girls who had the misfortune of being born under the wrong moon. The church was happy to take them. More souls meant more prayers. More prayers meant more divine credit. It was heaven's version of frequent flyer miles. Inside the walls, relationships blossomed. Not always romantic, though let's be honest, sometimes they were, but also friendships, bonds of survival, sisterhood forged through shared boredom, collective labour, and long nights whispering in candlelight about the world they'd left behind. Some wrote letters, some wrote songs, some wrote biting commentary on church hypocrisy under the guise of devotional reflection. Looking at you, Hildegard of Bingen. Meals were simple, often depressing. Bread, broth, a bit of root vegetable if God was feeling generous. On feast days they might get fish, or a single piece of dried fruit passed around like the Holy Grail. Gluttony was a sin. Hunger was a blessing. Fullness was considered suspicious. And if you asked for seconds, you'd be assigned extra penance, and a lecture about humility from Sister Agnes, whose breath could melt pewter. There were upsides. You didn't have to share a bed with someone who snored like a bear. You didn't have to bear children until your spine snapped. You could read. You could think. You could imagine a world where a woman wasn't just a walking cradle. In some orders, nuns produced illuminated manuscripts, botanical studies, even medical texts. It wasn't freedom, but it was closer than anything a wife ever got. Some convents were well-funded, beautiful places of art and learning. Others were drafty buildings held together by prayers and goat dung. In one, you might be taught Latin and philosophy. In another, you might be taught how to scrape mould off walls and make soap from pig fat. It was a lottery. But at least no one expected you to smile through childbirth or smile while being accused of not smiling enough. Occasionally, nuns rebelled. A famous case involved sisters breaking out of their convent to protest harsh conditions. Another involved a group secretly baking pastries during fasting periods and selling them through the back gate. These tiny rebellions weren't just about food, they were about agency, about choice, about the one thing medieval women rarely had a voice, even if it was whispering behind a locked door. And yes, scandals existed. Affairs with priests, secret pregnancies, mysterious deaths, the kind of gossip that made taverns buzz and bishops sweat. But more often, the drama was internal: who burned the linen, who snored during morning prayers, who had the audacity to look happy during Lent. Nuns were human, flawed, lonely, brave, stuck between salvation and survival. If a nun died, she was buried without fanfare. No grand procession, no inheritance squabbles, just a quiet service and a shallow grave marked by a wooden cross that would eventually rot. Her life often forgotten, her prayers collected by heaven, her silence expected. So the next time someone says women had it better in the old days, ask them if they've ever lived in a room full of cold porridge, unspoken dreams, and the lingering smell of sanctified socks. The convent wasn't freedom, but it was a crack in the system, a place to hide, a chance to breathe without being watched too closely. Because sometimes choosing solitude wasn't a rejection of love, it was a survival strategy. In the Middle Ages, if you were a woman looking for freedom, your best shot, ironically, was for your husband to die. No offence to the dearly departed, but widowhood was often the first time a medieval woman could take a deep breath without someone hovering behind her, asking, "What's for dinner?" Marriage chained you. Motherhood exhausted you. But widowhood. That was the closest thing to early retirement. Unless, of course, you were wealthy, in which case, congratulations, you had just become the juiciest piece of real estate in Christendom. For the average peasant woman, losing a husband was tragic, yes, but also oddly liberating. Suddenly there was no one to tell her where to go, how to pray, or when to stop talking. She could sell eggs in the market. She could wear black and glare at people in silence. She could even scandalously refuse remarriage. The church might raise an eyebrow, the neighbours might gossip. But the law for once gave her some autonomy. Probably because no one else wanted the job. Widows were allowed to own property, represent themselves in court, and conduct business. You heard that right, own. Not hold in trust for a man, not steward on behalf of her son. Actually own. It was the legal equivalent of medieval witchcraft. Peasant widows often took over farms or shops and ran them efficiently, sometimes better than their husbands ever had. Mostly because they weren't drunk by noon, or obsessed with jousting metaphors during accounting. And let's be honest, by the time most women became widows, they were tired. Tired of childbirth. Tired of men sneezing into their soup. Tired of being spoken to like decorative furniture. Widowhood meant silence, space, sometimes a goat of your very own. No one expected you to smile. No one expected you to conceive. You could at long last exist in the world without being someone's daughter, someone's bride, someone's problem. But this sweet taste of freedom, it came with conditions. First, you had to survive marriage, which was not a guarantee. With childbirth, fevers, plagues, and the occasional accidental sword wound, most women didn't make it to widowhood. And if you did, you still had to worry about vultures' legal ones. If you had sons, they might try to manage your estate. If you had in-laws, they might accuse you of witchcraft just to grab the land. And if you had no male heirs, God help you. Now, if you were rich, being a widow was an entirely different game. Because now you weren't just a person, you were property with legs. Everyone wanted a piece of you, your family, your husband's family, the church, the king. Suitors appeared overnight. Men you'd never spoken to sent you poems, pigs, and awkwardly carved rings. Some proposed marriage before the funeral had even finished. My condolences. And by the way, do you like vineyards? You became a walking opportunity. A wealthy widow could tip the balance of power in a region. Marrying her meant acquiring land title alliances and ideally access to a well-stocked wine cellar. Never mind if she was 45, toothless, and prone to shouting at pigeons. In medieval terms, she was a catch, so long as she could still sign a contract. But the freedom that money brought, it was fragile. You had to play your cards just right. Stay too independent and men called you arrogant. Remarry too fast and women called you cold. Say no too often and the church called you suspicious. It was a tightrope walk across a field of lecherous nobles and passive-aggressive priests. And all while wearing widow's black because you had to look appropriately sad, even if inside you were already planning to turn the dining room into a library. Let's not forget the sumptuary laws. These charming little rules told widows exactly how they could dress depending on their rank wealth, and whether society wanted to be reminded that a woman without a man could still breathe air. High-ranking widows wore veils, wimples, and sombre gowns. Peasant widows wore whatever wasn't currently on fire. Either way, you had to be modest, quiet, and ideally invisible. At least until someone needed help organising a baptism. The church had mixed feelings about widows. On one hand, they were symbols of purity, having endured the sacred duty of marriage and emerged alone. On the other, they were dangerous. Too much independence, too much free time, too many ideas. Some joined convents to avoid remarriage, trading bedsheets for prayer books. Others became benefactors, building chapels and donating funds in their husband's name, while quietly ensuring their own names got carved just a little bit bigger. Widows even had their own legal category, femme-sole. Sounds fancy, right? It meant she could conduct business, be sued, and exist without male representation. Of course, it was only recognised if she didn't remarry. Because the moment she said "I do" again, her rights vanished. Poof. Gone. Like a badly written inheritance clause. Suddenly the new husband owned everything, including her favourite goat, and the linen she'd been saving for special occasions. And don't think being a widow made you safe. In some regions, widows were seen as temptations, loose, vulnerable, witchy. Some were accused of bewitching men, causing their husbands' deaths with poisoned stews or seductive dreams. If you smiled too soon after the funeral, someone might throw holy water at you. If you didn't smile at all, they might do the same. Basically, the best way to survive as a widow was to fake sadness forever and hide your good cheese. Despite all this, many widows carved out rich lives. They ran taverns, they raised grandchildren, they told long uninterrupted stories by the fire, they joined pilgrimages, wrote letters, and occasionally told off bishops in Latin. Some even chose not to remarry radical, shocking, powerful. They became legends in their villages. There she is, people whispered, the widow who said no. And everyone quietly admired her while pretending not to. Meanwhile, remarried widows often ended up with worse husbands than the first. Younger, greedier, louder. Men who thought widow meant discount. These new marriages rarely lasted long, and when the second husband died mysteriously during turnip season, no one asked too many questions. Because at some point even the nosy neighbour started to realise maybe she just wants her soup hot and her evenings quiet. In literature, widows were often tragic or comic. The weeping widow, the scheming widow, the sexy widow who wore too much red and laughed too much at feasts. But real widows were complex. They were survivors. They were strategists. They were women who knew exactly how much a man could take from you and what it meant to finally get something back. So the next time someone praises the good old days of traditional family values, remind them for many women the best day of their married life was the one when their husband died. And while grief was real, so was the taste of power that came with breathing fresh air without permission. Because in a world that gave women nothing, being a widow gave you something rare, something dangerous, something almost holy. It gave you yourself. So your husband died. Maybe he choked on a chicken bone. Maybe he accidentally fell off the barn roof while trying to impress the neighbour. Maybe he just expired like a loaf of bread left out too long. No matter how it happened, you're free. Legally, spiritually, emotionally, the shackles are off. You can finally sit down without someone asking if the stew is done. And then, just as you're adjusting to the sweet silence of widowhood, someone shows up with a new marriage proposal. Because apparently one round of medieval matrimony wasn't enough torture. Remarriage in the Middle Ages was like rewatching a bad play, except this time the cast is worse, and the script is even more misogynistic. For women especially, those with property or childbearing years left, the pressure to remarry was immediate and heavy. Widows were seen as available by default. You didn't need to go looking for a new husband, they came to you like tax collectors with better grooming. Some would arrive at the funeral with a bouquet and a dowry offer. My condolences. So what do you think about Thursday? And this wasn't always just personal. Remarriage was a social expectation. A widow with no male protector was viewed as suspicious, too independent, too wealthy, too dangerous. Left alone too long, she might start reading managing her own money, or God forbid expressing opinions in public. Remarrying shoved her back into the box, made her someone's property again, and returned her to the comforting obscurity of domestic servitude. The church encouraged it. The neighbours expected it. The system demanded it. Now, for poor women, remarriage could be a necessity. You couldn't just run a farm or raise kids on your own, not in a society where women couldn't legally represent themselves in many transactions. Some widows remarried out of survival, choosing the least repulsive option who owned a donkey and didn't snore louder than a blacksmith's anvil. Others were coerced by family, by landlords, or by clergymen who thought holy matrimony meant marry anyone breathing. For noble women, it was more political than romantic. A rich widow was a walking title deed. Remarrying her meant gaining land power and maybe a strategically placed castle. If she hesitated, suitors could turn aggressive. Alliances were on the line. Feuds could erupt. Some women were kidnapped, yes, kidnapped and forced into remarriage. And the church, ever eager to preserve social order, often forgave the abduction if the marriage resulted in peace. Nothing says blessed union like Stockholm Syndrome with a tiara. Sometimes the children of the first marriage protested, because a new husband often meant new heirs, which meant less inheritance for them. Suddenly the widow was caught in a medieval soap opera stuck between greedy sons and an ambitious new suitor who insisted he loved her, but also seemed very interested in her vineyard. Family dinners got tense, and if the new marriage failed, well, there's always annulment. Just kidding. No, there isn't. Remarriage also came with conditions. A widow had to wait a decent amount of time before accepting another husband, usually a year, sometimes more. During this mourning period, she wore black, avoided social events, and definitely didn't smile too much. If she looked too cheerful too soon, rumours spread. Did she even like her first husband? Was she involved in his death? Is that new dress a sign of mourning or seduction? There was no winning. You could grieve too little. You could grieve too much. The way it was probably your fault. And don't think second marriages were any more loving than the first. Often they were more transactional. No courtship, no poetry. Just a handshake and maybe a sheep. Your new husband didn't want romance. He wanted labour land and someone to raise his children while he dealt with medieval back pain. And you wanted not to starve. Or maybe just someone who didn't smell like old ale and unresolved trauma. The church had rules, of course. You couldn't marry your dead husband's brother without a dispensation. You couldn't marry if you'd taken certain religious vows. You couldn't remarry too quickly unless you were a man, then it was fine. It is not good for man to be alone, said the Bible. But for women, apparently solitude turned them into witches, and no one wanted more witches. Some widows did remarry for love. They found kindness, or laughter, or at least a man who didn't treat silence as a sin. But these stories were rare, and they usually ended with someone dying heroically or getting stabbed by jealous in-laws. The average remarriage was about stability, about duty, about going back into the domestic meat grinder because society told you that an unmarried woman was an unstable woman, especially if she was happy. And a remarried life came with baggage, children from previous marriages, conflicts over titles, estate squabbles, step relations that made medieval households resemble bizarre sitcoms with a body count. This is your new brother husband. I mean stepfather. Don't ask. Just churn the butter. If the new couple didn't get along too bad. Divorce was still off the table and poisoning was frowned upon publicly at least. Some women played the game strategically. They remarried rich old men, waited, and became widows again. Each time they gained more land, more independence, and more gossip behind their backs. But who cared? A third-time widow was basically untouchable. Untouchable and terrifying. She survived 3 husbands, villagers whispered. She must be cursed. Or maybe, just maybe, she was smart. And of course, if you were unmarried and not a widow, just a single woman of age, you were seen as defective. Broken goods. Useless. But a widow who remarried was at least recyclable. Society accepted you, gave you a purpose, put you back in the system. You were no longer a threat, you were a wife again. Manageable, predictable, mostly. But make no mistake, remarriage wasn't a fresh start. It was a continuation. A sequel that rarely improved on the original. There were no new plot twists. Just the same chores, new arguments, and a growing awareness that your value was still tied to how much you could cook, bleed, or endure. A new man in the house didn't mean a new life. It meant you had to learn a new man's favourite stew recipe, emotional triggers and opinions on how loudly a woman should walk. So the next time someone says, back then people didn't give up on marriage, you can nod politely and respond, that's because giving up was illegal, and remarriage was just a reset button labelled try suffering again. And if they ask what it was like, tell them it was like being rewrapped, resold and reintroduced to a life where love was optional but obedience was not. Because in the Middle Ages, remarriage wasn't a second chance. It was just the same prison new warden. Once upon a time, a humble peasant boy fell in love with a noble lady. He brought her wild flowers. She smiled behind her veil. Their hearts beat faster every time their eyes met across the marketplace. And then the guards beat the boy with a stick and threw him in a ditch. The end. That's your classic medieval cross-class love story. Romance met reality, and reality had boots and a feudal structure that didn't mess around. In the Middle Ages, society was rigidly tiered. You were born into a class, you stayed in that class, and you died in that class, probably of something unsanitary. The idea of social mobility was about as realistic as a dragon retirement fund. If you were a peasant, you married a peasant. If you were a noble, you married another noble with the same number of surnames and slightly fewer syphilitic relatives. Anything else was treason, blasphemy, or just incredibly bad manners. Why was cross-class marriage so taboo, one-word property? Marriage wasn't about love, it was about keeping wealth where it belonged. Noble families had land titles and money they didn't want watering down with people who spent their childhood chasing pigs. A noble marrying a peasant wasn't romantic. It was dangerous. It meant inheritance confusion, potential uprisings, and the horrifying possibility that your grandchildren might one day milk a cow. Even among the lower classes, hierarchy mattered. A wealthier merchant's daughter marrying a thatcher's son, scandal. A blacksmith's apprentice falling for the baker's only child, tense. Medieval matchmaking wasn't just about who your family liked. It was about who wouldn't bankrupt the family goat. Compatibility was measured in acreage, not affection. Love was something that happened after marriage if you were lucky, or very drunk. But let's say 2 people from different classes fell in love anyway. They saw past the dirt, the titles, the generational trauma. What then secrecy? Letters hidden in flour sacks. Midnight rendezvous under suspiciously well-lit haylofts. Because going public meant consequences. At best, disapproval. At worst, exile, imprisonment, or a sudden invitation to take a long walk into the woods and reflect on your social station. Noble women were especially trapped. A lady marrying beneath her rank was seen as corrupting the bloodline, defiling the family honour, and possibly angering God himself. She might be disowned, forced into a convent, or married off to someone even worse, just to cancel out the shame. For noblemen, the rules were slightly more flexible. They could sleep with peasants all they wanted, as long as they didn't marry them. Love was allowed in the barn, not at the altar. There were exceptions. Rare, scandalous, whispered exceptions. A knight marrying a clever peasant girl who nursed him back to health. A merchant's daughter so wealthy that a minor noble agreed to marry down in exchange for gold. A widow who defied her late husband's will and chose love over lineage. But these stories were legends precisely because they were exceptions. People repeated them like bedtime tales, sweet, implausible, and very much not encouraged. And when cross-class marriages did happen, the social fallout was nuclear. The couple might be ostracised, denied entry to festivals, or quietly excommunicated. Their children would grow up in a limbo of whispers and awkward questions. Is he a noble or a farm boy? Why does he know Latin and how to shear sheep? Society didn't like blurred lines. It liked boxes, neatly labelled, preferably with coats of arms. The church, ever pragmatic, had mixed feelings. Officially, it allowed marriage across classes. After all, marriage was a sacrament. But in practice, priests discouraged such unions. Marry someone of your own station, they'd say. It's God's will. Translation don't cause problems we'll have to sort out later in confession. Also, please tithe regularly and avoid falling in love with the stable boy. Some noble families tried to fix the problem by elevating the lower-class spouse, granting them a tiny plot of land, a courtesy title, or just enough gold to make the union less embarrassing. Others doubled down, stripping inheritances, locking daughters in towers, or launching hastily arranged marriages to someone more appropriate and significantly more dull. Anything to preserve the sacred purity of boredom and inbreeding. Meanwhile, the peasant side of the relationship had its own issues. Suddenly you're expected to know how to dance without stomping, speak without swearing, eat soup without slurping. Your in-laws call you quaint while watching you like a pig in a parlour, and your old village, they think you've become a snob. You can't go home. You don't belong at court. You exist between two worlds, neither of which wants you unless you're very quiet and very useful. And then there's love-raw, vulnerable, hopeful love. Because somehow, against all odds, you care about this person. Their laugh, their kindness, the way they see you not as a pawn or a servant, but as something human. But love doesn't pay taxes. Love doesn't stop rumours. Love doesn't protect you when your new brother-in-law threatens to feed you to the hunting dogs as a joke. Let's be clear, cross-class marriage was a rebellion. A quiet one, a dangerous one. But rebellion nonetheless. It said, I see you, and I choose you, not because of your name, but because of who you are. And in a world built on control hierarchy and generational obedience that was practically heresy, beautiful, brave, and usually punished, there were rare triumphs. A couple who stuck it out, whose children blended the best of both worlds, who built a legacy not on bloodlines but on character. But those stories weren't celebrated, they were buried. Because if too many people believed in love over class, what would happen to all those carefully arranged power structures? You can't tax affection. You can't pass down land through hugs. So the next time you sigh over a medieval romance between a scullery maid and a prince, remember that story probably ended in exile scandal or an accidental sword wound. The real miracle wasn't that they found each other, it's that they tried at all. Because in a world that told you who to love, when to marry, and what your value was worth in coin choosing, love meant losing everything and doing it anyway. Imagine this, you're 15, you've never seen a map, and one morning your father bursts into your room, announces you're being married off to a man named Count something von something. And by the way, you're leaving today. Congratulations, you're now a foreign bride. No pressure, just represent your homeland, secure an alliance. And try not to offend your new in-laws by using the wrong spoon. If that sounds like a teenage girl's dream, congrats, you're a medieval diplomat with zero training and no choice. In the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't about love. It wasn't even really about family. It was international politics with fancy dresses. Kings married off daughters to seal treaties, calm down neighbouring warlords, or show off that they had more daughters than France had plagues. Brides were the original peace offerings wrapped in velvet, shipped across borders, and expected to smile through everything from strange food to arranged bedroom schedules. and the culture shock. Let's just say it was less eat, pray, love, and more cry, panic, repeat. A French girl marrying into an English noble house might as well have been launched to Mars. New language, new rules, new hairstyles, some of which involved glue and worst of all new toilets. The English didn't even have decent wine. They drank warm beer and called it nutrition. Welcome to your new forever. If you're picturing a weepy teenager sobbing into her embroidery, you're halfway there. The other half full-blown political weapon. Because every word she said, every gown she wore, every air she produced it all, reflected on her family back home. One misplaced curtsy could trigger diplomatic tension. One barren womb could end alliances. She was the Instagram account of an entire kingdom, except without filters and with considerably more disease. And don't think the grooms had it easy. Some poor medieval duke might have expected a sweet local bride who knew the family pigs by name. Instead, he got a mysterious perfume-drenched foreigner who didn't speak his dialect, didn't like his food, and probably had opinions. If he was smart, he smiled and kept quiet. If not, he made the classic mistake trying to change her. Spoiler alert, it never ended well. Now let's talk customs. Say you're a Spanish noblewoman used to fiery dances, loud dinners, and jewellery that could stop traffic. Suddenly you're married into a cold German duchy where dinner is boiled cabbage in silence, and no one touches each other before sunset. Or you're a Byzantine princess with a full court of etiquette advisors who suddenly finds herself married to a Hungarian prince who thinks forks are devilish and regularly eats with his knife by stabbing things mid-air. Missteps were inevitable. Laughing too loudly, unladylike. Refusing to kiss a random cousin in public, rude. Not knowing which relic to kiss during mass, blasphemous. And if you dared suggest that maybe, just maybe, wearing fur in summer was a bad idea, congratulations, you're now difficult. Let's not forget the gift exchange. Often a foreign bride brought a dowry so large it could fund a small war, which was incidentally the backup plan if the marriage failed. The bride herself was often given a morning gift, basically a medieval thank you for marrying me package from the groom, ranging from castles to land to jewellery big enough to sprain your neck. But if the marriage went south, good luck getting any of it back. And by south, we mean any minor insult infertility or the occasional coup. Language was its own battlefield. Many foreign brides never fully learned the language of their new homeland, so they relied on hand signals, facial expressions, and the universal language of passive aggression. It made love letters, difficult arguments even more so, and diplomacy an absolute circus. Some noblewomen eventually learned the language, but usually only after being mocked by servants for years. Medieval Rosetta Stone wasn't included in the dowry. And what about religion? Oh boy. Marrying across countries often meant marrying across denominations too. A Catholic princess shipped off to a barely Christian Slavic court. Get ready for awkward baptisms, holy relic confusion and debates about saints that ended in accidental exorcisms. Religion wasn't just personal, it was political. So the wrong gesture at the wrong time might lead to accusations of heresy, or worse, being exiled with nothing but your pet falcon. Of course, some foreign brides adapted. They charmed the court-made alliances and rewrote the rules. But even the most brilliant among them lived on a knife's edge. One wrong pregnancy, one failed negotiation, one overheard insult about the local bread. And it was over. Not just the marriage, the alliance, the peace, and maybe even her life. There were success stories. Anna of Kiev married Henry Thrones of France and ruled as queen with unexpected grace. Eleanor of Aquitaine, while not exactly foreign by modern standards, used her marriages to bend entire kingdoms. These women weren't just survivors, they were political forces. But for every Eleanor there were a dozen anonymous brides whose names were erased, whose letters were burned, and whose lives were reduced to the woman from that place who didn't fit in. And let's not forget the children. Half foreign, half local, often treated as both exotic and suspicious. They inherited titles but not trust. They were walking reminders of alliances and therefore walking targets. Some became great rulers, others mysteriously fell ill during important succession disputes. Being born of two worlds was a poetic tragedy, especially when one of those worlds really wanted you gone. Now here's the kicker, most of these marriages didn't even work. Affairs, betrayal wars reignited anyway. But the women, they had to stay, smile, endure, perform. Because going home wasn't an option, not unless you enjoyed the idea of being branded a failed bride and used as a cautionary tale during winter feasts. So next time you hear a fairy tale about the foreign princess who changed a prince's heart and saved a kingdom, remember, she probably spoke 5 languages, cried herself to sleep for 6 years, and was allergic to the local soup. Foreign brides weren't just symbols, they were survivors. Thrown into the unknown, expected to thrive and blamed if they didn't. They were the original ambassadors, with no training, no passport, and often no voice. So you thought therapy was invented in the 20th century? Think again, because medieval couples had something even better: confession. Yes, that sacred little box in the back of the church where you knelt, whispered your sins and hoped the priest wouldn't recognise your voice. This was the medieval version of marriage counselling. Except instead of working through your issues together, you told a celibate man that your husband smelled like sheep, and your wife kept calling you by her ex's name, and if you confessed wrong, straight to hell. No second session. The church was the moral referee of marriage, and oh boy did it love blowing the whistle. Lust, sin, infidelity, eternal damnation. Enjoying yourself too much during sex, that's 2 sins in one. Medieval doctrine turned intimacy into a checklist of what not to do on which days, in which positions, and how long you were allowed to feel anything before guilt was mandatory. Basically, if you smiled in bed, St. Augustine frowned somewhere. And what about your partner? You couldn't really confront them. That was considered disruptive, even rude. If your husband was cheating, you told God, not him. If your wife was neglecting her duties, you brought it to the parish priest, who'd offer a stern prayer and maybe some Latin guilt to take home. Communication in medieval marriages went like this: don't talk to each other. Just confess, repent, and pretend it didn't happen. Let's not forget the confessional traps. If you admitted to lusting after your neighbour's spouse, even just thinking it, you'd be slapped with penance. But if you didn't confess it, and the priest sensed it, you'd get double penance. Either way, your soul was toast. The church had built a system where every human urge was a landmine, and talking it out meant kneeling on stone while being asked if you'd ever looked at someone's ankles for too long. And then there were the public penances. Picture this: your wife accuses you of adultery. The priest agrees. Now you're paraded through the village in a sackcloth barefoot while everyone throws week-old bread at you and prays you don't try to sit near them at Sunday Mass. In modern terms, it was therapy via public shaming, often accompanied by the smell of the rotten cabbage and the sounds of your in-laws clapping. For couples on the verge of collapse, say the wife fled to her mother's hayloft, or the husband took a vow of silence just to avoid arguments, there was always the bishop's tribunal. Imagine a courtroom run by men who thought women were created from man's rib for decorative purposes. The wife might complain her husband beat her. The bishop would ask, did he do it with intent, or was it just spiritual correction? You can guess the verdict. Sexual problems, also solved by the church. If a husband refused his wife her marital rights, yes, that was a thing, she could bring him to court. The priest would then determine whether the man was impotent sometimes by asking for witnesses. Because nothing screams privacy like having the town blacksmith testify whether or not your wedding night sounded vigorous. Some priests took it upon themselves to guide couples, often by handing them a list of forbidden days. Mondays, no sex. Holy days, absolutely not. Lent, don't even think about it. Fridays, only if you wanted to risk eternal damnation. In total, there were about 150 days a year where intimacy was forbidden. That left roughly 215 days minus illness, famine, and sleeping in separate straw piles. No wonder they had so many wars. People needed something to do. But not all confessions were about sin. Sometimes they were about suspicion. A jealous husband might confess that he thought his wife was flirting with the miller. The priest would nod, stroke his beard, and suggest maybe it was time to lock the wife inside more often. Problem solved, except for the wife, of course, who now had to explain to her chickens why she hadn't seen sunlight in 3 weeks. There were also group confessions, usually during festivals or Lent. Imagine the entire village lining up one by one, mumbling about marital missteps, envy, and that time someone maybe made eye contact with a nun. The priest, overwhelmed, would just assign blanket penance, no meat for a week, extra prayers, and for the couple arguing loudly during service, clean the church floor with a wet rag. Together, romantic. Oh, and did we mention trial by ordeal? In particularly nasty accusations, say a woman was rumoured to have slept with her brother-in-law, there were options. She could voluntarily undergo an ordeal to prove innocence, like holding a red-hot iron bar, walking 3 paces, and then having the wound examined a few days later. If it healed, God said she was innocent. If it festered, well, time to re-evaluate that marriage certificate. Nothing like third-degree burns to restore trust. The problem with medieval marital counselling was that it wasn't about healing. It was about order, maintaining appearances, keeping the church in power and the couple in line. If the man drank too much and spent all the money, pray harder. If the woman screamed nightly because her arranged husband was 52 and smelled like boiled onions, confess your discontent. The system didn't fix marriages, it covered them in incense and hoped no one coughed. Sometimes couples genuinely wanted help. They went to monks, nuns, or friars for advice. These holy folks, despite being celibate, became the de facto marriage experts. Their advice usually boiled down to suffer well, forgive often, and remember your place. One monk wrote that if a wife felt unloved, she should offer her suffering to Christ. That's not counselling. That's weaponized guilt wrapped in a halo. And let's talk about abuse. If a husband beat his wife, well, the church technically didn't approve, but enforcement spotty at best. The line between discipline and domestic horror was blurry and often decided by the man doing the hitting. A woman could appeal to the bishop, but unless her bruises spelled out Latin, her case was probably going nowhere. Meanwhile, if the wife struck back, straight to public penance, maybe even excommunication, because nothing threatened order more than a woman with an opinion and a right hook. And if she killed her husband, even in self-defense, they turn her into a parable. Let this be a warning, unhappy wives breed chaos. Cut to dramatic Gregorian chanting. By the late Middle Ages, some efforts to improve marriage did emerge mainly by writers and philosophers trying to soften church doctrine. But those voices were quieter than a nun at a sword fight. The average couple still relied on confession shame and the occasional holy relic to patch things up. And if that failed, well, there was always silence. The medieval version of we're working on it. So next time you complain about couples therapy being awkward, remember at least your therapist doesn't make you parade through town in sackcloth while holding a candle and confessing that you once looked at your neighbour's thighs during Mass. Medieval marriage counselling was less about healing and more about control. Less conversation, more condemnation. It didn't help you connect, it helped you comply. In short, if your medieval marriage was falling apart, you didn't fix it, you confessed it, and you prayed your sins burned slower than your reputation. Let's take a breath, shall we? After trudging through cold stone chapels, bed-bug-ridden marriage beds, bridal contracts written like livestock receipts, and priests prescribing guilt like herbs, we arrive at the question you might still be asking, half laughing, half cringing. Do you still want that fairy tale wedding? The kind with flowing gowns, rings exchanged under candlelight and doves? Maybe not plague rats fluttering overhead. Because if your dream wedding includes a 12-year-old bride, an audience of lice-infested villagers, and a banquet where nobody bathed but everyone belched prayers between gulps of sour ale, then yes, you'd have fit in perfectly. In the Middle Ages, fairy tale wasn't a genre, it was a coping mechanism. A story you whispered to yourself while your husband snored after the fifth mead cup, and the village priest reminded you that desire was a gateway to eternal fire. The truth is, romance didn't write the rules back then, property did. Politics did. Survival did. Weddings were contracts, alliances, or excuses to move goats from one village to another, under the blessing of the church. Even the wedding dresses weren't white. They were just the nicest thing you owned, which usually still smelled like the last festival. The idea of love that was for ballads and wandering minstrels, men who sang about courtly passion while sleeping alone in a barn. What about the happily ever after, more like barely survived after? A successful medieval marriage meant producing sons not dying in childbirth and avoiding public scandal. It wasn't about kisses in the rain or romantic candlelit dinners. It was about not being accused of witchcraft, adultery, or secretly being French. Forget flowers and vows. Half the time the groom was drunk and the bride was terrified. Even fairy tales, real medieval ones, weren't sweet. Cinderella's stepsisters sliced off parts of their feet to fit the slipper. Sleeping Beauty was cursed with blood, not glitter. And Snow White. She didn't just fall asleep, she was almost buried alive. These stories weren't lessons in love. They were warnings. Stay pure. Obey. Don't marry above your class. Don't disobey your father. And above all, don't dream too big. So why do we still long for that medieval romance? Why do castles feel magical and vales feel sacred? Maybe it's because we've rewritten history into lace and roses, cropping out the dirt, fear and despair. We imagine medieval weddings with soft music and flickering torches, but not the smell of open sewers outside the church. We dream of knights carrying brides across thresholds, but not the part where she was bought, sold, or never asked. The good news is we've come a long way. We don't live in a world where the church decides if your marriage is valid based on whether your bedsheet has blood. We don't marry off children to settle debts, or at least we're trying not to. Modern weddings, for all their chaos and cost, are now hopefully about choice. About love. About two people saying, I pick you without needing a priest to verify if they're sober or not dying of plague. But maybe that's the real takeaway. Not just that medieval marriage was horrifying, but that it taught us what to fight for. The right to say yes and no. The right to leave. The right to love who we choose, even if it's messy, complicated, and nowhere near perfect. The fairy tale isn't the white dress or the perfect day. It's the freedom to decide your own story. So no, you wouldn't want a medieval marriage. Not unless you enjoy lice silence and spiritual despair served with warm ale. But a modern marriage, one built on mutual respect and bad dancing under fairy lights, that's worth dreaming about. Just maybe skip the dungeon-themed venue and make sure the priest is actually invited this time.